100 experience points to the first gate. He has two of them, one for inhaling, one for exhaling. Dan lies face down on the stone floor, beaten half to death in a foreign body in a foreign world. And he's almost smiling. 100 is just 100 times 1, and he knows how to count to 100. He opens his eyes and doesn't recognize a thing. A dark, cracked ceiling, the smell of mold and someone else's sweat. His body aches as if it had been put through a meat grinder and then pieced back together with crooked hands. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know where he is. But he understands one thing right away. This body breathes horribly. Ragged, shallow breaths. His shoulders jerk with every inhale. His diaphragm is clenched tight. This man has been gasping for air his whole life, even before they started beating him. Somewhere to the right, someone is beating someone else with a stick and counting. 12, 13, 14. So Dan turns his head. A dozen skinny boys in gray bandages line the stone walls. Some are sleeping. Others are staring into the void with dead eyes. In the corner, a burly guy is methodically beating a teenager who's kneeling and saying nothing. So Dan looks down at his hands. Skinny. Ribbed. A brand is seared into his left wrist. An outer circle student. Dust rank. He can't read these symbols, but he understands their meaning, as if his body remembers what his mind does not. He exhales. Slowly. Counting to 6. Not because he knows why, but because it's the only thing he knows how to do, in any body, in any world. The exhale is longer than the inhale. Always. And the voice rings out again. An achievement. The first conscious exhale. One experience gained. He hasn't stood up for 3 days. His body won't obey him. His legs start shaking after 10 seconds. The ribs on the right have fused crookedly. The left shoulder won't rise above the ear. This boy was beaten for a long time and with relish. So Dan does the only thing he can. He breathes. Inhale for a count of 4 through the nose. Pause for 2. Exhale for a count of 6 through pursed lips. Each inhale is +1. Each exhale, add 1. By the end of the first day, 26 counts. By the end of the second, 49. And the body responds. On the second day, the diaphragm drops a millimeter on the inhale, maybe 2. So Dan picks up on this and feels a professional sense of joy. It's not the muscles moving, it's the nervous system remembering that the dia even exists. Twice a day, a bowl of porridge and a mug of water appear beside him. He doesn't see who brings them, just light footsteps and quiet, uneven breathing. Someone small. Someone who's also afraid to breathe deeply. On the third day, he gets kicked in the side. Standing over him is that same burly guy with the stick. A broad face, small eyes, a leaf rank insignia on his belt. He growls that he's had enough of lying around, that a dust rank who can't stand on his own 2 feet doesn't get food, that tomorrow everyone is going to the stream for water, and if So Dan doesn't come out, they'll throw him into the manure pit. So Dan nods and counts. The boy's breathing is ragged and rapid, 22 breaths per minute. A healthy person breathes 12. This one is either sick or lives in constant fear, or both. The stick comes down on his shin, just to keep him in line. So Dan doesn't flinch. It hurts, but he doesn't gasp for breath from the pain. He exhales exactly with each blow. The pain squeezes him in as he inhales. It lets go as he exhales. His voice rings out. An achievement. He didn't hold his breath during the blow. Plus 10 experience points. The big guy walks away, so Dan smiles at the stone floor. 10 for a single blow. A good rate. Morning of the 4th day. He stands up. It takes 4 minutes. On his side, on all fours, one knee, the other. Up. The world is swaying. His legs are shaking. His ribs ache. But he's standing. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 6. A senior branch rank student lines up 8 dusts and leads them to the stream. 300 steps down the trail. Buckets. Yoke poles. Draw water. Carry it to the kitchen, 300 steps uphill. Repeat until evening. So Dan picks up the yoke, and his body remembers something. Not the memory of a beaten-up boy. Something else. He knows how to distribute the weight across his shoulders. He knows to shift his weight 2 fingers width back from the center. He knows to turn his feet outward 15 degrees. He knows to synchronize his stride with his breathing. 2 steps on the inhale, 3 on the exhale. He doesn't rush forward. He walks steadily. First trip. The water doesn't splash. Second. Same. 3. Fourth. By noon, the rest are sprawled on the ground with their legs shaking. Some are throwing up. Others just stare at the sky. So Dan goes for his 5th. His 6th. His 7th. By evening, he's completed 22 laps, and his legs aren't shaking. The senior looks at him for a long time. Then he hits him on the back with a stick, hard, and snarls that he was cheating. That you can't without effort. That it's suspicious. So Dan bows silently. His voice rings out. An achievement. The first step of the technique. The water carrier doesn't spill a drop on himself. Plus 120 experience points. Attention! The first node of the shoulder meridian has been opened. He doesn't know what a meridian is. He doesn't know what a node is. But something in his left shoulder is warming up, as if a hot napkin had been placed inside it. He doesn't let on. He bows once more and leaves. In the evening, he eats porridge against the wall. Someone small sits down next to him. A girl, about 15 years old, skinny. Her left eye twitches. She sets down a second bowl. The porridge is thicker, and on top is half a boiled egg. She doesn't look at him. She stares at the floor and breathes so quietly it's almost inaudible. Short, shallow breaths, like someone who's been taught that loud breathing gets you beaten. She mumbles that the cook told her to give away the extra food. A lie. Dan can tell by the way she looks away. The cook didn't order anything. She brought it herself. He takes the bowl and thanks her. She nods and scurries away like a mouse. So Dan eats the egg and thinks. This girl isn't breathing wrong because she doesn't know how. It's because she's afraid. Something broke her a long time ago. Something to do with breathing. And now her body remembers that fear every second. He knows this type. He's seen dozens of them. People recovering from long illnesses. Children who were smothered with a pillow. Elderly people recovering from pneumonia. They all breathe the same way. Shallow and quiet. As if they're apologizing for breathing at all. Her name is Yoon Sori. He'll find that out later. Day 5, 6, 7. So Dan carries water. 20 trips every day. Every evening, plus 100 experience points and more. Her body is changing. Unnoticeable to others, but he can feel it. His diaphragm drops deeper. His ribs expand wider. His left shoulder is a centimeter higher than it was a week ago. The warmth in his shoulder no longer fades away. On the 7th evening, he sits by the well and practices his breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 6, hold for 2. A square with an extended exhale, the basic exercise he taught every new patient. Yoon Sori appears. She sets down a bowl and doesn't leave. She stands there and watches. A minute, 2, 3. Then she quietly asks what he's doing. I'm breathing. Everyone breathes. Not everyone. Most people here don't breathe. They gasp for air with their mouths. You, for example, breathe so shallowly that your lungs fill up only a third of the way. She freezes. Then she whispers that she isn't allowed to breathe deeply. That when she was 8, she had a high fever, and the doctor said that a deep breath would bring the fever back. So Dan looks up at her. A gaunt face, a slight twitch. Her fingers are clenched around the edge of her apron. She believes it. For 7 years, she's believed that a deep breath could kill her. He tells her to sit down. She hesitates. She sits down. He doesn't tell her to breathe deeply. He doesn't tell her to relax. He doesn't say the doctor was a fool. He tells her to place her palm on her stomach, just below her navel. Just place it there. She does. Feel the warmth of your palm through the fabric. Just feel it. She nods. Now breathe in so that your stomach pushes against your palm. Just a tiny bit, a millimeter. Not deeply, a millimeter. Yoon Sori inhales. Her stomach moves almost imperceptibly. Her eyes fly open. She hasn't died. There's no heat. Her stomach just pushed against her palm. Good. Exhale and try again. She tries. Her stomach pushes 2 millimeters, then 3. 5 minutes later, she's breathing the way she hasn't in 7 years. Not deeply, just a little deeper than she's used to, by a tiny fraction. But for the first time in 7 years, her lower ribs move as she inhales. The ticking of the clock stops. For a second. Then it resumes. But that second existed. Yoon Sori looks at So Dan as if he'd given her something priceless. She says nothing. She stands up and leaves. The bowl remains. Inside it is half a boiled egg again. In the second week, pain came to So Dan. Not that dull, aching pain he'd grown accustomed to from day one. A different kind. Sharp. Burning. It came at night and woke him with a jolt. His left shoulder was burning from the inside. That very meridian node, the one that had opened up after the day with the buckets, was now throbbing with heat. So Dan clenched his teeth and sat up. Everyone in the barracks was asleep. He placed his right hand on his left shoulder and felt the heat beneath his fingers. Not on the outside, on the inside. It was as if someone had lit a small candle under his skin. The voice in his head was silent. No achievements, no clues, just pain. So Dan did the only thing he knew how to do. He began to breathe. In for 4, out for 6. He didn't try to suppress the pain. He didn't try to understand it. He just breathed alongside it, like he would with a sick patient. You don't treat it until you understand what's hurting. 20 minutes later, the heat softened. It didn't go away, but it stopped being hostile. So Dan gently moved his shoulder. The joint traced its usual arc and suddenly moved further. A centimeter, maybe a centimeter and a half. His arm rose higher than it had yesterday. He froze. He tried again. Same result. Something inside his shoulder had softened from the heat, an old adhesion, a long-standing scar on a muscle or ligament. The heat had softened it, and his breathing had helped the blood flush out that area. So Dan didn't know the word qi. He didn't know that the warm water in his shoulder was exactly that. But he knew that the body heals itself if left undisturbed, and that breathing is the first tool that opens the door to everything else. In the morning, he went out to the stream before anyone else. The sky was gray. The air was damp and cold. So Dan stood on the bank and did something he hadn't done since the very first day. A warm-up. Slow, circular shoulder movements, torso bends, foot rotations. Every movement was linked to his breath. Every one was conscious. +1, +1, +1. He took his time. 7 minutes of basic mobility exercises. In his former life, he'd led this warm-up for elderly patients before they walked down the hallway. Here, it worked differently. On the third shoulder rotation, he felt the warmth again. On the fifth rotation, the warmth traveled down his arm toward his elbow. It was strange and a little frightening. But So Dan didn't stop. He breathed steadily. He moved slowly. He let his body do what it wanted. By the time the rest of the dust arrived, he had already finished and was standing by the buckets with the yoke on his shoulders. A guy with a cane named Kang Dae-soo looked at him suspiciously. So Dan nodded at him and walked toward the stream. 22 strides, just like yesterday, just like the day before yesterday, just like every day. By the end of the second week, he noticed something. The other dusts had started to imitate him. Not consciously. They simply saw that he was placing his feet differently and tried to do the same. They saw that he was breathing with his mouth closed and tried that too. One of them, a 14-year-old boy named Gu Taek with a long scar on his cheek, began making 15 trips instead of 10. Not because So Dan had taught him, but because he saw how he placed his feet. So Dung noticed this and said nothing. He simply sat down a little closer to Gu Taek by the well the following evening and began doing breathing exercises. Gu Taek glanced at him. So Dung didn't offer any guidance. He didn't explain. He just breathed. Inhale for 4 counts. Exhale for 6. After 3 minutes, Gu Taek quietly began to repeat the pattern. His breathing was ragged and uneven. His inhale was too short. His exhale was too abrupt. But he was trying. So Deng slowed his rhythm slightly. Gu Taek slowed his. They sat like that for 10 minutes, in silence, breathing. No one was teaching anyone anything. Just 2 people side by side. A voice in his head chimed softly. Achievement. The first student copied the rhythm without being told, plus 15 experience points. So Deng didn't understand why he'd been given 15 for that. After all, Gu Taek had done it all on his own. But the system saw it differently. Yoon So-ri came every evening. She set down a bowl. She sat down next to him. She was silent. Sometimes he taught her how to breathe. Not every time. Sometimes they just sat there. She told him that she'd been working in the kitchen since she was 10, that the chef hit her on the hands for being slow, that she had no rank because the gates wouldn't open, that she was considered an empty breather. So-den asked what that meant. She explained that there are people whose qi doesn't flow through their bodies. Air goes in and out, but leaves nothing behind, like a sieve. So-Dan thought for a moment. Then he said he didn't believe it. She looked at him in surprise. He said that if she could feel the warmth of her palm on her stomach, then she had chi. It was just locked up, like water behind a dam. Yoon-sori lowered her eyes and didn't say anything. But the next day, she arrived 5 minutes early. The third week brought the first real danger. Kang Dae-soo, a boy with a staff, approached him in the morning and said that the instructor for the outer disciples wanted to see him. So-Dan followed him down a long corridor past the training grounds where leaf-rank disciples were practicing their basic forms. Their movements were sharp. Their breathing was loud and ragged. Their shoulders were tense. So-Dan watched and counted the mistakes mechanically. The instructor's name was Bae Han-il. He was a short, thin man in his 40s with a neat beard and attentive eyes. He had 2 open gates. So-Dan didn't know this, but he sensed that the air was different around this man. Thicker, warmer, like standing next to a stove. Baek Han-il sat at a low table drinking tea. He looked at So-Dan for a long time. Then he said that a boy of the dust rank makes 22 trips carrying water a day, that the average for dust is 8, that the average for leaf is 14, that he, Baek Han-il, wanted to understand where a boy with no lineage and no technique and not a single open gate could possess such endurance. So-Dan stood there, wondering how to respond. He couldn't tell the truth. He was a master of breathing techniques from another world who had accidentally discovered that the biomechanics of walking with a load work the same way in any universe. That wasn't an answer they would understand. He said he was simply trying his best, that he didn't know any techniques, that he placed his feet however felt comfortable and breathed however he could. Bae Han-il looked at him for another minute. Then he said that the monthly dust evaluation would take place in 3 days. Whoever demonstrated a sufficient level would be promoted to leaf. Those who don't will remain dust for another month. Those who score lower than last time will be reassigned to manure work. So-Dung bowed and left. 3 days. He didn't know what the assessment entailed. He didn't know what level was considered sufficient. He knew nothing about the ranking system except that dust was the bottom rung. He began to listen in the kitchen while helping to peel vegetables and by the well when the other dust members were talking among themselves. In the barracks before bed when whispering was the only sound. The test consisted of 3 things. Running along the trail around the sect, about 3 li, that's about 1.5 kilometers. Holding the basic stance for as long as you can hold it, and 1 strike, any strike with any limb. The instructor evaluates the strength and accuracy. So Dan could pass the run, the standing test too. But the strike? He didn't know a single combat technique, not a single skill. So Zhe's body had never been trained for combat. He was the sect's weakest student, and everyone knew it. So Dung thought about it for 2 evenings. Then he made up his mind. He wouldn't strike like a fighter. He would strike like a person who understands how the body works. In his previous life, he had helped people regain their gait after knee replacements. He knew how force is transmitted from the foot through the hip to the torso and into the arm. Not as a martial arts master, but as a physical therapist. But biomechanics doesn't lie. A punch is a kinetic chain, the foot into the ground, the hip into rotation, the torso into rotation, the shoulder forward, the arm as the final link, and an exhale at the moment of contact. All on the exhale. So Dan spent 2 evenings by the barracks wall training a single straight right-hand punch. No speed, no power. Just the chain. Foot, hip, torso, shoulder, fist. Inhale on the wind-up. Exhale on impact. 100 repetitions the first evening. 100 the second. Each one done with full awareness. +1. +1. +1. Test day, 23. Dusts lined up on the field. Coach Pei Han-il stood in the center with his arms folded. Next to him were 3 branches serving as judges. Kang Dae-soo was among them, holding a stick. Running. So Dan ran at a steady pace. Not fast, not slow. 2 steps inhale, 3 steps exhale. The same rhythm as with the buckets. He finished 5th out of 23. Not bad for a body that couldn't even stand 3 weeks ago. Standing. Basic stance. Feet shoulder-width apart. Knees slightly bent. Back straight. Hands in front of the chest. So Dan stood up and began to breathe. Inhale for 4. Exhale for 6. His legs started to burn after 3 minutes. After 5 minutes, they started to shake. After 7, the first dust began to fall. After 10, 8 people were still on their feet. After 15, 5. After 20, 3. So Dan and 2 others. So Dan stood and breathed. His legs were shaking, his knees were screaming, but he didn't hold his breath. He didn't clench his jaw. He didn't push through the pain. He relaxed everything he could and tensed only what was necessary to stay upright, his quadriceps and glutes. Everything else remained loose. 25 minutes later, the second one fell. 28 minutes later, the third. So Dan stood alone. 30 minutes, 31, 32. Bae Han-il raised his hand and said, "Enough." So Dan straightened his knees and almost fell. But he didn't fall. A punch. So-dae walked over to a wooden post wrapped in straw. He stood up. He inhaled. Foot planted on the ground. Hip, torso, shoulder, fist. Exhale. The punch wasn't loud. It wasn't spectacular, but the post swayed. Not much, but it swayed. Bae Han-il walked over and felt the spot on the post where the blow had landed. Then he looked at So-dan. Then at his fist. There was no blood on his knuckles. Usually, the dust had their hands smashed to a pulp with the very first blow. So-dan landed a clean hit because he struck correctly. Not with his hand, with his whole body. Bae Han-il said nothing. He nodded and jotted something down on a small board. That evening, the results were announced. So-dan had been promoted to the Leaf rank. He was the first dust in 2 years to receive a promotion after just 1 evaluation. Kang Dae-soo watched him from across the arena, twirling a stick between his fingers. It wasn't anger. Something worse. A lack of understanding. The Leaf rank meant 3 things. First, a separate barracks. Not a stone floor, but wooden bunks with straw mattresses. Second, access to the training ground. 3 hours a day with an instructor. Basic forms, strikes, stances, blocks. Third, 2 meals a day instead of 1. So-dan got a spot on the bunks by the wall and a mattress that still smelled of its previous owner. He didn't sleep the first night in his new place. Not because he was nervous. Out of habit. 3 weeks on the stone floor had trained his body to fall asleep in only one position. Now the surface was different, and his body didn't know what to do. So Dan lay there and breathed. In for 4, exhale out for 8. Longer than usual. A sleep rhythm. A protocol for insomnia that he used with patients after surgery. After 20 minutes, his body gave in, and he fell asleep. A quiet chime rang in his head. An achievement. The first hour of sleep with his neck in the correct position. plus 30. He didn't hear it. He slept. The morning began with a shout from Master Leaves. His name was Won Tae-il, a tall, wiry man with 3 scars on his right arm from the claws of a mountain beast. 3 open gates, a voice like iron striking stone. He lined up 20 leaves on the training ground and began demonstrating the form. The first basic one, the bow stance. Left foot forward, right foot back. The knee of the front leg over the toes. Back straight, hands in position. Won Tae-il demonstrated it once. He told them to repeat it. So Dan assumed the stance and immediately sensed something was wrong. The angle of his front knee was too sharp. His back foot was turned inward. His weight was shifted forward. This stance destroys the knees. After 10 minutes of standing still in it, his anterior cruciate ligament would be on fire. After a month of daily repetitions, the ligament would start to tear. So Dan looked at the other leaves. 3 of them already had trembling knees. 1 was grimacing in pain, but enduring it. So Dan adjusted his stance. He moved his front foot forward by 2 toes. He turned his back foot outward by 10 degrees. He shifted his weight slightly backward. The aching in his knee stopped. His stance became more stable. Won Tae-il walked past. He stopped. He looked at So Dan's feet. He said the stance was incorrect. So Dan bowed and returned to his starting position. 5 minutes later, when Won Tae-il turned away, he adjusted it again. Not completely, by half a degree. Enough to take the strain off his knee, but not enough for anyone to notice. He would do this every day, half a degree at a time. In a month, his stance would look canonical, but function correctly. After morning training, So Dan discovered a problem. He had no technique. The other leaves had at least one, the bamboo's basic strike. The simplest technique of the silent bamboo sect. A straight strike with the palm, projecting chi through the center of the palm. All the leaves taught it. So Dan couldn't. Not because he didn't want to. He didn't feel enough chi to direct it into his palm. There was warmth in his shoulder. Warmth would sometimes appear in his chest after a long breath, but he couldn't control it. It was like a patient who can feel a muscle after a stroke but can't move it. The connection is there, the control isn't. So Dan decided not to rush. Instead of trying to master the bamboo strike, he focused on what he knew how to do. Breathing, movement, body control. He practiced the forms without chi, pure biomechanics. Stance, step, strike, turn. Every movement was conscious. Every movement was tied to his breath. It looked strange. When the other leaves struck, they released a thin wave of heat. For some, it was the size of a palm. For others, a finger. But it was there. So Dan had nothing. A bare strike, but precise, but with the correct kinetic chain, but with an exhalation at the moment of contact. Kang Dae-soo found him a week later. Not with a stick, with 3 friends. All 4 were branch rank. Evening. The path to the well. So Dan was walking to fetch water for the barracks. The 4 of them emerged from behind the bushes. Kang Dae-soo said that dust shouldn't have become a leaf so quickly, that it was suspicious, that maybe So Dan had stolen someone's technique, or maybe he had a patron among the elders, or maybe he's just lying to everyone and isn't who he claims to be. So Dang set down the buckets, not because he was preparing for a fight, because the buckets were heavy and his arms were tired. He said he hadn't stolen anyone's technique, that he was just carrying water. Kang Dae-soo punched him in the stomach. So Dan doubled over. Pain, bright and sharp. But he exhaled through it. He didn't hold his breath. He straightened up, Kang Dae-soo struck him again, in the chest. So-dan flew into a tree. His back slammed into the trunk. He slid to the ground. Kang Dae-soo's 3 friends stood and watched. Kang Dae-soo walked over and crouched down beside him. He said quietly that if So-dan drew the instructor's attention to himself one more time, it would be worse next time. So-dan sat by the tree and breathed. In, out. His ribs ached. His chest burned. But he was breathing. 10 points for not holding his breath during the blow. 10 more points. Kang Dae-soo stood up and left with his friends. So-dung waited 5 minutes. He stood up. He picked up the buckets. He walked to the well. He drew some water. He carried it to the barracks. 200 steps. Inhale on 2. Exhale on 3. His ribs creaked with every step. But he made it. That night, Yoon Sori came to see him. Somehow she found out. The kitchen staff always know everything first. She brought an ointment that smelled of camphor and something bitter. She said a herbalist from the outer circle had given it to her. So-dun asked which herbalist. Yoon Sori said the one who's always coughing. So-dun remembered. Yoon Sori silently rubbed the ointment on his chest and sighed. Her hands were small and cold, but deft. She didn't look him in the eye. The twitch in his left eyelid grew stronger. She was angry. Not at him, at those who had hit him. So-dan thanked her. She said it wasn't her, but the herbalist. So-dan said he was grateful to both of them. Yoon Sori stood up and left. She paused at the door. She said quietly that she had learned to breathe in 1 millimeter deeper. 1 millimeter every day, and that her belly was already pushing her palm out by a whole finger's width. So-dan smiled. She didn't see it. She had already left. The next day, he found the herbalist. The courtyard of the outer circle. A small outbuilding by the wall, crammed with sacks of dried herbs. Han Min-ju, 19 years old, short, quick hands, 20 little pouches on her belt, a tongue as sharp as a knife. She was coughing, quietly, discreetly, but So-dan heard it. It wasn't just a cough, it was asthma, bronchospasm on exhalation, a soft whistling sound that she masked with a cough. She'd been doing this for years. So-dan stood in the doorway. Han Min-ju looked at him and said that if he'd come for the ointment, the price was 2 copper coins. If he didn't have any coins, he should leave. So-dan said he'd come to thank her. She said that gratitude doesn't heal bruises. So-dan said she was right. Then he said her cough wasn't really a cough. Han Min-ju froze. Her expression changed. It grew stiff. She said she didn't understand what he was talking about. So-dan said it was a wheeze when she exhaled, that her bronchial tubes were constricted, that it was hardest for her in winter and just before dawn when the air was cold. Han Min-ju was silent. Then she quietly asked how he knew. So-dan said he could hear it. She looked at him for a very long time. Then she said that if he told anyone, she would poison him in his sleep, and no one would ever know how. So-dan said he wouldn't tell anyone. Then he said he could help, not cure her, but ease her suffering. Han Min-ju silently gestured toward a bench and told him to sit down. He spent 2 hours with her. He listened to her breathing. He counted her inhalations and exhalations. He determined that her exhalation was 1.5 times shorter than normal. Her bronchi constrict as she exhales, and air gets trapped inside. Classic obstruction. In his previous life, he worked with patients like this every week. He showed her how to breathe through pursed lips, a slow exhalation through a narrow gap. This creates pressure that keeps the bronchi open. Simple. Elementary. But Han Min-ju had never heard of this. Here, asthma was treated with herbs and acupuncture. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. No one ever addressed the breathing itself. She gave it a try. Inhale through the nose. Exhale through pursed lips, slowly, counting to 8. The wheezing lessened. It didn't disappear, but it lessened. Han Min-ju closed her eyes and exhaled again. And again. On the third exhale, the wheezing vanished. For 5 seconds. Then it returned, but there were 5 seconds of silence. She opened her eyes. There was something in them that So-dang had seen many times before. Hope. Cautious. Fearful. Like a little animal that had poked its nose out of its burrow and wasn't yet sure it was safe. She asked what he wanted in return. So-dae said nothing. She said that didn't happen. He said it did. A month passed. So-dae counted the days by the notches on the underside of the bunk. 31 notches. 31 dawns on the training grounds. 31 nights of breathing exercises by the well. His counter read 94 out of 100. 6 points to the first gate. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what would change when the number reached 100. But his body was telling him. The warmth in his shoulder had become constant. The warmth in his chest appeared every morning after his breathing practice. Sometimes he felt something in his stomach. Not pain, movement. As if something inside were slowly unwinding. Like a spring that had been coiled up many years ago and was now slowly being released. Training was tough. Not physically. Physically, he was progressing faster than any of the leaves. His stance was the best on the court. His strikes were more precise. His stamina was incomparable. The problem was with chi. By this point, all the other leaves could at least channel a little energy into their strikes. A faint glow on their fists. A warm wave when pushing with his palm. So Dan couldn't do it. His body generated chi. He could feel it. But there was a chasm between feeling it and controlling it. Won Tae-il, the leave's mentor, was beginning to lose patience. He would approach So-dan after training and say that physical fitness without chi was an empty vessel. Beautiful on the outside, but useless on the inside. So-dan bowed and remained silent. He couldn't explain that he was working on this every night, that he lay in the dark trying to channel the warmth from his chest to his palm, that every time the warmth reached his elbow and dissipated, like water in the sand. The meridians of this body were in poor condition. Old rib fractures, tight muscles, adhesions, scars on tissues he couldn't even see. So Jay's body had been broken long before Daniel got involved. He had to repair it millimeter by millimeter, every day. Han Min-ju now came to see him on her own, every morning before dawn. They met behind the stable, where no one went at that hour. So-dang showed her the exercises. Breathing through pursed lips. Breathing with an extended exhale. Diaphragmatic breathing while lying down. Breathing with resistance. He drew up a daily routine for her. 10 minutes of breathing exercises while lying down in the morning after waking up. 5 minutes while sitting before bed. Throughout the day, 1 minute of exhaling through pursed lips every hour. Before going out into the cold, 3 deep breaths through the nose, followed by a slow exhale through the mouth. Han Min-ju followed everything with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. She was the kind of person who, once given a tool that worked, used it without hesitation. After 2 weeks, her nighttime wheezing had been cut in half. After 3 weeks, for the first time in 4 years, she slept through the night without waking up from shortness of... She came to him in the morning after that night and silently placed 3 little bags in front of him. One contained herbs for bruises, the second held a powder for joint pain. The third contained something that smelled of honey and bitterness. She said the third was a restorative formula for the meridians, rare and expensive. Her last. So Dan started to refuse. Han Minju looked at him in a way that made him fall silent. She said it wasn't a gift, it was an investment, that she wasn't a fool and could see what he was doing for people, that if he healed himself faster, he'd be able to help more people, and that meant she'd benefit too. So Dan took the pouches. That evening, he brewed the restorative concoction according to her instructions. He drank it. He lay down and began to breathe. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 6. The warmth came immediately. Not from his shoulder, from his stomach. Hot and dense, like boiling water. It rose through his chest to his throat, and for a second he was frightened. But he exhaled. And the warmth flowed downward, through his arms, through his legs. It flowed along pathways he didn't know. Meridians. They were like the beds of dried-up rivers, cracked, clogged. But the warmth flowed through them and softened the walls. So Dung lay there and felt his body from the inside for the first time, in its entirety. Every crevice, every scar, every knot. There were many of them. Dozens. So Chu's body wasn't just weak. It was damaged. Systematically. Someone had been beating this boy for years. Not just now and then. Regularly. So Dung lay in the darkness and breathed. The warmth slowly washed over one knot after another. It didn't untie them. It simply touched them, getting to know them. Like a doctor who, during an initial examination, places his hands on the patient's body and simply feels. A voice rang in his head. Achievement. First complete scan of the meridians. Plus 50 experience points. Attention. 11 damaged areas detected. Gradual restoration is recommended. Start with the lower dantian. So Dung didn't know what a dantian was, but he knew where it was. Just below the navel, where Yun So Ri places her palm when she practices breathing. 98. 99. 100 came quietly. During morning training, So Deng stood in the bow stance and breathed, steadily, calmly, just like every day. Wan Tae-il was saying something to the others. So Deng wasn't listening. He could feel the warmth in his abdomen pulsing in time with his breath. Inhale, the warmth expands. Exhale, the warmth contracted. Like a heartbeat, a second heart, deeper than the first. And on the 100th conscious breath of that day, something clicked. Not loudly, not painfully, as if someone had turned a key in a lock that had been closed his whole life. The warmth in his stomach flared up and became hot for a single second. Then it settled down. But something had changed. From that moment on, So Deng felt the air differently. He inhaled and sensed that, along with the air, something else was entering him. Subtle, cool, alive. It was qi, not his inner qi, external, the world's qi. It entered with every breath and settled in the place where the lock had clicked, in the lower dantian, drop by drop. The voice in his head rang out more clearly than usual. Achievement. Opening of the first gate. Plus 500 experience points. Attention. External qi absorption activated. Current absorption rate, 1% of the breathing cycle. It is recommended not to increase the workload for 7 days. 1%. Su-dung almost laughed. 1% is not much, insignificantly little. Other disciples who had opened the first gate were absorbing 5 to 10%. But So-dae wasn't discouraged. 1% is 1% more than 0, and 0 was yesterday. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't show it. He didn't celebrate. That evening, he sat by the well, and Yoon So-ri sat beside him. She was breathing. Her belly pushed against his palm. No longer just one finger, but 2. Her breathing had grown deeper, more even. The occasional twitch happened less often. She told him things she'd heard in the kitchen, that Elder Kim was sick and hadn't left his quarters, that an envoy from the White Crane sect had arrived and brought gifts, that Master Bae-han-il had quarreled with Master Won-tae-il over some disciple. So-dan listened. Yoon So-ri knew more about life in the sect than any disciple, because the kitchen was a place where tongues were loosened. So-dang asked which student the instructors had quarreled over.
윤소리는 그를 보았다. 그녀의 왼쪽 눈꺼풀이 떨렸다. 그녀는 그가 그에게서 떠나야 한다고 말했다. 배한일은 서대영이 사립학교로 전학을 가야 한다고 생각했다. One-tail believes a boy without CI isn't worth paying attention to, that his physical results were a fluke, that in 2 months he'd hit the ceiling and stop growing. So-dan nodded. One-tail was wrong, but So-dan wasn't going to prove it to him. It wasn't time yet. He thanked Yoon So-ri. She nodded and left. The next day, she brought him 2 rolls instead of 1. One had a sesame seed on it. She said it tasted better with sesame. It was true. That night, So-dan had a dream for the first time. Not an ordinary dream, a different one. He was standing in a white space. No walls, no floor, no ceiling, only light. And in front of him was a woman. Young, beautiful, with eyes so dark that his gaze drowned in them. She stood there looking at him. Then she raised her hands and began to slowly fold her palms together, right over left. Her fingers were intertwined. Her thumbs touched at the tips. A simple gesture, but there was something about it. So-dan watched and memorized it. The woman smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes, and the white space melted away. He woke up. His head was ringing. An achievement. First contact with residual consciousness, plus 50 experience points. A hint. The hand position is called the Dantian lock. It's used to concentrate qi in the lower center during static meditation. Suo-deng sat up on the bunk. He folded his hands the way the woman had shown him, right over left, fingers interlaced, thumbs together. And he inhaled. The qi came immediately. Not just 1%, 3, maybe 4. Warmth flared up in his stomach and began to hum. So Dan exhaled, and the warmth subsided. But it remained, more than there had been before. He didn't know who this woman was. He didn't know why she appeared in his dreams. He didn't know what residual consciousness was. But he knew one thing. She wants to help him, and he'll accept that help. The second month in the Silent Bamboo sect began with rain. Cold, fine, endless rain that turned the trails into mud and the air into thick fog. Training wasn't canceled. Won-tae-il said that a warrior doesn't choose the weather. Leaves lay on the public and practiced their forms. Their wet clothes clung to their bodies. Their feet slipped on the clay. By evening, 3 of them had developed fevers. So Dan stood there, breathing. Rain ran down his face. The cold bit into his skin. But inside, he was warm. After the first gate opened, qi flowed into his body with every breath. Slowly, drop by drop, but it flowed, and every drop was warm. He no longer felt the cold as he used to, not because he had become stronger, but because his body had learned to draw slightly more energy from the air than it lost. Balance, the most basic principle of survival. Consume more than you expend. For the first time in a month, So-Dan smiled during training. Won-tail noticed and frowned. Leaves don't smile in the rain. Leaves endure. After training, So-Dan returned to the barracks and found his mattress on the floor. Wet. Someone had taken it out into the rain and brought it back. One of Kang Dae-soo's friends was sitting nearby, smiling. So-Dan looked at the mattress. He looked at the guy. He picked up the mattress. He wrung it out. He spread it out on the bunk. He lay down. It was wet and cold, but it was just water. It would dry from the warmth of his body. He closed his eyes and began to breathe. The Dantian lock. Hands folded. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6. Qi flowed into his abdomen and warmed him. 20 minutes later, the mattress was warm. Not dry, but warm. The guy by the wall stopped smiling. So Dan fell asleep. In the morning, he woke up before everyone else and went to the stable. Han Min-ju was already there. There was no coughing, none at all. She stood upright and breathed evenly. So Dan stopped. He listened. Her exhalation was clear. No wheezing, no rattling. She noticed him and said that today was the 3rd morning in a row without an attack. So Dang nodded. Good, but don't let your guard down. Your bronchial tubes could constrict at any moment. You need to stick to your regimen at all times. Han Min-ju nodded. Then she said she wanted to ask him something. So Dan said he was listening. She said that the pharmacist in the village at the foot of the mountain had a 12-year-old daughter. She'd had weak lungs since birth. She coughed up blood every winter. The local doctors have given up on her. They say it's bad blood, and there's nothing they can do. Han Min-ju asked if he could take a look. So Dan said he would take a look. He didn't promise to cure her. He promised to take a look. Han Min-ju nodded and, for the first time, smiled slightly. Meanwhile, an event was brewing within the sect, the Outer Sects Tournament. Once every 6 months, the region's outer sects would send their best disciples to spar. Not to the death, only until one tapped out or lost consciousness. The winners received resources for their sect, herbs, silver, and technique manuals. For a small sect like Silent Bamboo, this was important. Master Bae Han-il summoned all the leaves and branches to a general assembly, 30 disciples. He announced that the tournament would take place in 2 months, that the sect would field 6 contestants, 3 branches, and the 3 best leaves. So-Dan stood in formation and listened. 2 months, 8 weeks. He did the math. Right now, his first gate was open. His qi absorption was 3 to 4%. One basic form that he performs flawlessly, but without qi. Not a single combat technique. He would be facing disciples from other sects with the second gate open and real techniques. He didn't stand a chance. Or maybe he did. So-Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't learn combat techniques. He wouldn't have time in 2 months. Instead, he would perfect what he already had: breathing, movement, biomechanics, and reading his opponent's rhythm. He would be the most technically skilled fighter in the tournament, not because his technique was better, but because he wouldn't have any technique that could be broken. For the next 4 weeks, So-Dan trained like he'd never trained before.
In the morning, basic forms with the leaves. In the afternoon, he carried water. He volunteered to go back to carrying the buckets. Won-tae-il didn't understand, but he allowed it. So Dan carried water and thought. 200 steps uphill with a load isn't just an exercise. It's a model of combat. The weight presses down. The body grows tired. Your feet slip. And you either keep your breathing rhythm or you break. In the evening, he walked to the well and trained alone. Not forms, something else. He stood with his eyes closed and listened. The wind, footsteps, the breathing of passers-by. He was learning to distinguish people by the rhythm of their breathing. Kang Dae-soo breathed 22 times a minute, a rapid, nervous rhythm. Won-tae-il breathed 14 times, steady and deep. Bae Han-il breathed 10 times, almost imperceptibly. Yoon So-ri breathed 16 times. It had become 16. It used to be 20. So-dung counted and memorized. If he hears someone else's breathing, he knows his opponent's rhythm. And if he knows the rhythm, he can break it. Not with force, with his own breathing. Because rhythm is contagious. If you stand next to someone who breathes slowly and evenly, after a minute, your breathing will start to adjust to theirs. It's a reflex. Mirror neurons. Basic neurophysiology. So Dan tested this on Yoon So-ri, on Han Min-ju, on Gu Tae. It worked. Every time. He would sit down next to them and start breathing in a certain rhythm. After 2 or 3 minutes, the person next to him was breathing the same way, without even noticing. That was his weapon. Not a strike, not a technique. Breathing. The second gate opened in the 6th week of the 2nd month, as quietly as the first. No fireworks, no light. Just a click inside and a new channel through which warmth flowed. This time, along the spine. So-dang was lying on the bunk in the Dantian lock posture and felt something open up in his lower back, like a valve. Qi surged up his back. It reached his shoulder blades. It split into 2 streams, down his arms to his fingertips. So-dan froze. His fingers tingled, like static electricity. He raised his hand and looked at it in the darkness. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. His fingertips were warm, hot even. A voice rang in his head. Achievement. Opening of the 2nd gate, plus 1,000 experience points. Current absorption rate, 7%. It is recommended to continue working on the meridians of the upper limbs. So-dan clenched his fist. Heat gathered in the center of his palm. Dense, tangible. He could control it. Not perfectly, but he could. He unclenched his fist and directed the heat into his index finger. It obeyed. Slowly, with a delay, but it obeyed. So-dan exhaled. Now he had qi in his hands. This meant that the bamboo strike was no longer just an empty phrase. He didn't try it right away. For a week, he simply practiced moving qi through his hands, from his palm to his fingers, from his fingers back to his palm, from one hand to the other across his chest. Every movement was deliberate. Each one was a step forward. By the end of the week, he could gather qi in his right fist in 3 seconds. Slowly. An experienced fighter does it instantly, but 3 seconds is better than never. On the 8th day, he went out to the training ground in the evening when everyone had left. He stood in front of the straw pole. Inhale for a count of 4. Gather qi into his right palm. Foot planted on the ground. Hip.
torso, shoulder, palm forward. Exhale, bamboo strike. The pole shook. The straw at the point of impact turned black, not from fire, from pressure. The chi passed through his palm and slammed into the pole. Weak, barely noticeable. First-year leaves make it stronger. But this was his first strike with chi, his first real technique in this world. His head was ringing. An achievement. The first application of chi in combat. Plus 200. So Dan stood before the pole and looked at the blackened straw. Then he struck again. And again. And again. 10 strikes, each slightly stronger than the last. Each deliberate. Each with the right breathing. On the 11th, his chi ran out, and the strike came out empty. So Dan stopped. 11 strikes. That was his limit. For today. Tomorrow, there would be 12. A week before the tournament, So-Dan was sitting by the well one evening. Yunsori and Gu-tak were sitting nearby. They were breathing. Silently. In rhythm. So-Dan listened to them. Yunsori's breathing had become completely different. Deep. Steady. Her stomach rose and fell smoothly. The ticking of the century happened once an hour, maybe less. She was a different person. In 2 months. Not because she had become stronger, but because she had stopped being afraid to breathe in. Gu-tak had changed too. His trips with the buckets had reached 18 a day. Not 22 like So-Dae's, but 17 was twice as many as in the first week. He didn't know why. He was just following suit. So-Dae stood up and said it was time to sleep. Yunsori nodded. Gu-tak nodded. They went their separate ways. So-Dae lay on his bunk and thought about the tournament. In a week, he would face people who had been training for years. People with real techniques, real mentors, real combat experience. He had his breathing, biomechanics, 11 strikes with chi, and the ability to disrupt his opponent's rhythm. It wasn't much, but it was enough, because he doesn't need to defeat everyone. He needs to stay unbroken. And he knows how to stay unbroken. The Outer Sex tournament took place on a plain between 3 mountains, a wide field trampled by thousands of feet, wooden bleachers in 3 rows, the flags of the 12 sects flying on poles. The Silent Bamboo sect brought 6 members, 3 branches and 3 leaves. So Dan was one of the leaves, the youngest in rank, the quietest. Pei Han-il insisted on his participation, despite Wan Tae-il's objections. The journey to the plain took 2 days on foot. So-Dang walked and counted his steps. 2 steps inhale, 3 steps exhale. A familiar rhythm. On his back was a bag of spare clothes and a small pouch of herbs from Han Min-ju. She hadn't come along. Herbalists aren't allowed at the tournament. But before leaving, she gave him 3 packets of powder and told him that the green one was for pain, the white one for bleeding, and the red one for a worst-case scenario, if things went really badly. So-Dang asked what was in the red one. She said it was better not to know, and better not to try it. The plain was noisy. Over 200 students from 12 sects. The smallest was the Silent Bamboo sect. The largest was the Iron Fan sect. 40 students. Their uniforms were black with silver embroidery. Their movements were sharp and precise. Their best fighter had reached the 3rd gate. So Dan watched and listened. The breathing of the Iron Fan disciples was strange. A short, sharp inhale. A pause. An explosive exhale. Like a blacksmith's bellows. Powerful, but wasteful. They expended more chi than they gained with each cycle. This meant their fights had to be short. A long fight would exhaust them. So Dan took note. The draw took place on the morning of the third day, so Dan drew number 14. His first opponent, a disciple of the Stone Stream sect. Rank list, second gate. Specialization, wrestling and grappling. So Dan learned this from Gu Tak, who had been going around the camps eavesdropping on conversations. A good kid. So Dan thanked him and went to prepare. The first fight, the arena. A circle of trampled earth 10 steps in diameter. The referee stood in the center. Sodang stepped out and stood facing his opponent. The guy was a head taller than him, broad-shouldered, arms like logs, low stance, a wrestler. Sodang assumed a bow stance. He took a breath, he closed his mouth, and began to listen. His opponent's breathing was deep and slow, 14 breaths per minute. A good rhythm, steady. This guy wasn't nervous. He was confident. The referee gave the signal. The wrestler stepped forward. Heavy footsteps, arms wide. He wanted to grab Sodang by the belt and throw him. Sodang didn't back down. He stepped to the side, not quickly, smoothly, as he exhaled, and began to breathe louder. Not a scream, not a growl, just steady, noisy breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, rhythmically, slowly, 10 breaths per minute, slower than his opponent's. The wrestler turned and moved forward again. Sodang stepped aside again. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Slowly, steadily, loudly. On his third attempt to grab him, the wrestler missed and nearly fell. His breathing became erratic. It went from 14 to 16. He began to get angry. Anger speeds up your breathing. Rapid breathing disrupts your qi. Disrupted qi weakens your technique. So Dan counted and waited. On the fourth attempt, the wrestler grabbed his sleeve. So Dan didn't break free. Instead, he stepped toward the wrestler, right up close, chest to chest, and exhaled into his face. A long, steady, warm breath. The wrestler froze for half a second. A reflex. Someone else's breath in your face causes a momentary confusion. So Dan used that half second. His right palm struck the solar plexus, the bambuk strike. All his chi in a single blow. Not powerful by this world's standards, but precise. Right on target. Timed with his opponent's exhale when the abdominal muscles were relaxed. The wrestler doubled over. Air whistled out of him. He fell to one knee. So Dan stepped back. The wrestler tried to stand up. He stood up, but his breathing was ragged. 24 breaths per minute. Jerky, short. He couldn't gather the chi for a technique. So Dan stood and breathed. 10 breaths per minute. Steady, calm. The wrestler lunged forward in a desperate attack. So Dan ducked low, dived under the arm, palm to the side, second bamboo strike. The wrestler collapsed and didn't get up. The referee raised his hand. Victory for Sodan of the Silent Bamboo sect. The second fight was 3 hours later. A disciple of the White Mist sect, a swordsman, a slender wooden sword. The second gate. This one was faster, so Dan took 2 sword strikes to the ribs before he found his opponent's rhythm. His ribs burned. Old fractures flared with pain. But he didn't hold his breath. He exhaled through the pain. Plus 10. The swordsman was breathing rapidly, 18 breaths per minute. Each sword strike was accompanied by a sharp exhalation. That's what he had been taught. Exhale on the strike. Good technique, but predictable. So Dan listened and counted. Inhale, pause. Exhale, strike. Inhale, pause, exhale, strike. Rhythm, pattern, flow. On the fifth cycle, Dan moved not on his opponent's exhale, but on his inhale. When the sword was still high, when his opponent's body was exposed. The swordsman didn't expect it. Dan slipped under the sword and struck his opponent's chest with his palm. Not hard, but with chi, and with the right exhale, right into the swordsman's face. The swordsman froze, half a second. Dan struck again, to the stomach. The swordsman flew back 3 steps and fell. He stood up. The sword trembled in his hand. His breathing was off. He tried to regain his rhythm. Inhale, pause, exhale. But his body was already falling into Dan's rhythm. 10 breaths per minute. Too slow for his technique. The sword felt heavy. His strikes lost their sharpness. Dan stepped forward and struck a 3rd time. Shoulder. The swordsman dropped his sword. The referee raised his hand. The 3rd match was the next day, the semifinals. And there stood He Junwan, heir to the He clan, 19 years old, 5th gate. Dan saw him and stopped. Not out of fear, out of surprise. Ha Junwan stood at the edge of the arena, and his breathing was perfect. 10 breaths per minute. Deep, steady, not a single unnecessary movement. His chi was as solid as a rock. Deng could feel it from 3 steps away, like a wall of warm air. This man was 3 levels above everyone else in the tournament. Deng didn't understand what the heir to the great clan was doing at the Outer Sects tournament. Then he realized it wasn't the tournament that mattered. What mattered was humiliating the weak, showing the difference, reminding everyone who was in charge. He Junwan stepped into the arena. Dan stepped forward to face him. Jungwan was handsome. Tall, straight-backed. His black hair was tied in a knot. He wore a dark silk robe with the Ha clan crest embroidered in gold. He looked at Dan, without contempt, without interest, like a rock in the road. The referee gave the signal. Jungwan didn't move. He stood there, waiting. Dae didn't move either. He stood there, breathing. 10 breaths per minute. The same rhythm as Jungwan's. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. The spectators began to whisper. 30 seconds of silence. No one moved. 2 people stood facing each other, breathing. Deng listened. Jungwan's rhythm was perfect, but lifeless, like a metronome. Steady, mechanical, flawless. But there was a crack in that evenness. Jungwan always breathed the same way, the same depth, the same pause. He didn't adapt. He didn't change. His body had been trained to a single, perfect rhythm and knew no other. Dan began to change his own, slowly. His inhale was slightly longer. His exhale was slightly shorter. A shift of half a second, then another half second. His rhythm wavered. It became uneven, but not chaotic. Controlled irregularity. Like a jazz musician who plays not to the beat, but to his own beat. Jungwan blinked. His body sensed the foreign rhythm and began to react to it. Not immediately, not strongly, but his perfect 10 breaths became 9.5, then 10.25. His metronome faltered for a split second. So Dang saw it and stepped forward. Junwan struck reflexively. A palm strike with chi. Powerful, fast. So Dang didn't block it. He shifted his torso 3 degrees. The blow whizzed past his temple. The wind from his palm swept the hair off his forehead. So Dang stepped even closer and exhaled. A long, steady exhale right into Jungwon's face. And at the same time, his breathing became even more erratic, ragged, unpredictable. Jungwon's body panicked. His metronome had broken. His rhythm faltered. His chi flowed through the wrong channels. His second strike was weaker than the first. The third was even weaker. So Dang stepped back just enough to avoid each one. He didn't block. He didn't counterattack. He simply breathed beside him. 40 seconds. Junwan was breathing in time with So Dang. Not his own. Someone else's. And his technique fell apart. Not because it was bad, because it was honed for a single rhythm. And that rhythm was gone. At the 45th second, Junwan stopped. He stood there, gasping for air. 20 breaths per minute. His face was white. He didn't understand what had happened. So Deng stood across from him, breathing evenly, calmly. 10 breaths per minute, just like at the beginning. Junwan looked at him. There was something new. Not anger. Horror. Because So Dung hadn't struck him even once. Not a single blow. He was simply breathing. And that was enough to shatter the technique of the great clan's heir. The referee looked at both of them. Junwan straightened up. His hands were trembling. He tried to assume his stance. He couldn't. His chi wouldn't obey him. His body wouldn't obey him. He lowered his hands and said he was giving up. Quietly, so that only the referee could hear. The referee raised his hand. Victory for So Dun of the Silent Bamboo Sect. Silence in the stands lasted 3 heartbeats. Then it erupted into whispers. So Dun bowed and left the arena. His legs were shaking. Not from fatigue, from the rush of adrenaline. He had won a fight he wasn't supposed to survive, against a man 3 levels higher, without a single strike. He sat down behind the sect's tent and rested his head on his knees. His hands were trembling. His head was ringing. Achievement. A victory over an opponent 3 gate levels higher. Plus 500. Achievement. First successful use of the rhythm-shattering breath technique. Plus 300. So Dan closed his eyes and exhaled, long and deep, counting to 8. His hands stopped trembling. The return trip to the sect took 2 days, so Dan walked in silence. Baek Han-il walked beside him, also silent. Something heavy hung between them. Not hostile, questioning. Baek Han-il had seen all 3 fights. He saw that So Dan hadn't used a single technique from the Silent Bamboo Sect. He saw that he had won with his breathing. And he didn't know how to feel about it. During a rest stop on the evening of the first day, Baek Han-il sat down next to him and asked directly, who had taught him this? So Dung replied that no one had, that he'd taught himself. Baek Han-il was silent for a long time. Then he said that in 30 years of teaching, he had never seen anything like it. That disrupting the breathing of a 5th gate master without a single strike was not a technique. It was an understanding of the nature of qi at a level he himself had not yet reached. So Dan didn't know what to say. He didn't understand the nature of qi. He understood the nature of breathing. These are different things. Or maybe not. Perhaps in this world, they are one and the same. Behan-il said that upon returning to the sect, he would speak with the elders, that So-dan needed special treatment. So-dan asked him not to do that. Behan-il was surprised. So-dan said he didn't want to stand out any more than he already had, that attention was dangerous. Behan-il looked at him as an adult, not as the 16-year-old Pil who had become Leaf 2 months ago. Then he nodded and didn't bring up the subject on the road. The sect met them in the evening of the 3rd day. Yoon So-ri was standing at the gate. She saw So-dae and her left eyelid twitched 3 times in a row. Then she ran to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, a bowl of hot noodles with meat was standing in front of him. Meat was a rarity in the Silent Bamboo sect. Yoon So-ri had stolen it from the mentor's supplies. So-dan ate in silence. The noodles were too salty, but it was the best meal he'd had in 4 days. Han Min-ju arrived an hour later. She sat down across from him. She looked at his face, then at his ribs. She said there were 2 bruises from a wooden sword and 1 soft tissue contusion in the liver area. So-dang was surprised. He hadn't told her about the fight with the swordsman. She said she could tell by the way he was breathing. His right side was slightly restricted. That meant his ribs. His exhalation was a second shorter than usual. That meant his liver. So-dang looked at her with respect. She was learning faster than he'd thought. Han Min-ju took out some ointment and began massaging his side. Her hands were firm and precise. She spoke as she worked. She said that while he was away from the sect, things had happened. That Elder Kim had died. Quietly, in his sleep. That there were now 4 members on the Council of Elders, not 5. That 2 of the 4 wanted to form an alliance with the He clan for protection. That the other 2 believed the sect should remain independent. So-dang listened. An alliance with the He clan after he had publicly humiliated their heir? That's not an alliance, it's submission. Or a trap. Han Min-ju said she thought the same thing. Then she said the apothecary's daughter was waiting for him, that her coughing up blood had gotten worse. So-dang nodded and said he would go tomorrow. In the morning, he went down to the village, a small settlement of 30 houses at the foot of the mountain. The apothecary, Park Yeon-soo, met him at the doorstep, a short, gray-haired man with weary eyes. His daughter, Park Sul-gi, was lying on a bed in the back room. 12 years old, pale as paper, dark circles under her eyes. She coughed every 3 or 4 minutes, a dry, rasping cough, sometimes with pink foam on her lips. So-dang sat down beside her and began to listen. Her breathing was weak and shallow, 28 breaths per minute. Too frequent. Her lungs were working at their limit, but she still couldn't get enough air. He asked her father to step out. Then he placed his hand on the girl's chest, gently, with qi. For the first time, he used qi not to strike, but to diagnose. The warmth from his palm entered her chest and spread through her lungs, and he sensed it. The left lung was functioning normally. The right one wasn't. The lower lobe of the right lung was dense, clogged. Not inflammation, something else. So Dan withdrew his hand and thought. In his previous life, he would have said bronchiectasis, or chronic aspiration, or a congenital anomaly. Here, he couldn't say for sure, but he could help. He couldn't cure it, not right away, but he could help her breathe better with what she had. He showed Pak Sil-gi how to do postural drainage. Lie on her left side with a pillow under the right side of her chest, head slightly lower than her body, and breathe, slowly, deeply, with the left lung. Don't use the right one. Let it rest. The girl looked at him with her big eyes and did as he said. 10 minutes later, she coughed up a clump of thick, dark phlegm. Then another. Then she began to breathe more freely. Not perfectly, but easier. The apothecary stood in the doorway and wept silently. So Dan drew up a regimen for her. 20 minutes of postural drainage 3 times a day. Breathing exercises in the morning and evening. A warm drink before each session. Han Minju would select the herbs. He didn't promise a full recovery. He promised that the coughing up blood would subside. The pharmacist asked how he could repay him. So-dong said, "Nothing." The pharmacist insisted. So-dong said that if the girl got better, the pharmacist should tell others that there is a way to breathe properly, that it's something that can be taught. The apothecary nodded. Upon returning to the sect, So-dong discovered that the silence had ended. Word of his victory over He Junwan had spread throughout the corridors. The disciples looked at him, some with respect, some with fear, some with envy. Kang Dae-soo no longer approached him, not because he had come to respect him, but because he was afraid. A man who had broken the heir to the great clan without a single blow posed a danger that was impossible to fathom. And an incomprehensible danger is more terrifying than one that is understood. Won Tae-il, the Leaves' mentor, had also changed. He no longer criticized So-dong for the lack of chi in his strikes. He didn't speak to him at all. He avoided him during training. He didn't correct him. He didn't praise him. He didn't acknowledge him. That was worse than criticism. It was alienation. So-dong realized he had become an inconvenience. He didn't fit into any category. Not a genius, not a mediocrity, not an heir, not an orphan in the full sense of the word. Something else. Something that had no place in the hierarchy of the Silent Bamboo sect. And that frightened people more than weakness or strength. A week after his return, the first assassination attempt took place. So Dan was having dinner in the barracks. Rice porridge, tea, an ordinary evening. He took his first sip of tea and paused. The smell. Slightly bitter. Not like usual. He knew that smell. Han Minju had taught him to identify basic poisons. Lesson 3. Yellow root. Not lethal in small doses, but enough to cause convulsions and loss of consciousness for several hours. So Dan set down his cup. He looked around. No one was looking at him. Everyone was eating. Everyone was drinking. He quietly stood up and left. He found Han Minju. He handed her the cup. She sniffed it, looked at him, said it was yellow root. Half a lethal dose, not enough to kill, just to knock him out. Why knock someone out for the night? So-dong wondered. If he lost consciousness for the night, he'd be helpless. Someone might come, search him, or worse. Han Minju said that the yellow root was hard to come by. It wasn't available within the sect, so it must have been brought in from outside, which meant the He clan. So-dong nodded. He'd expected this. Victory comes at a price, and that price had arrived sooner than he'd thought. Han Minju said that from now on, she'd be checking his food. So-dong said he didn't want to burden her. She replied that it wasn't a burden, but practice, that it was good for her to train her sense of smell. So-dae didn't argue. He saw in her eyes what he'd seen in the best nurses in his previous life, a calm, fierce determination. Yoon So-ri found out about the poison the next day. She came to see him that evening with red eyes. She wasn't crying, but she was close to it.
She said she wasn't the one who poured the tea. She explained that another girl had covered her shift in the kitchen the day before. That girl had received a silver coin from one of the sect's guests. Yoon So-ri found that girl, and she confessed. The man who gave her the coin was dressed for travel, with no sect insignia. His face was covered. He asked her to slip the powder into So-dan's tea and left that same evening. So-dan listened. Yoon So-ri spoke quickly and quietly. Her tic had returned in full force. Her left eyelid twitched every 5 seconds. She was angry and afraid. So-dang put his hand on her shoulder and told her everything was fine. She looked at him and said that nothing was fine, that someone had tried to poison him, that next time they might not slip in yellow root, but real poison. So-dan said that's why he had Han Min-ju for poisons and Yoon So-ri for information. Yoon So-ri froze. Then she said he was talking as if it were normal. So-dan said it wasn't normal, but it was reality, and it's better to face reality with your eyes open and breathing. The third month in the sect began with changes. So-dae developed what he called the morning routine. 7 movements: neck rotations, shoulder circles, torso bends, spinal twists, hip circles, rising onto the toes, squats. Each movement is synchronized with the breath. Each lasts exactly 10 breaths. 7 movements, 70 breathing cycles, 12 minutes. He did this every morning by the well before dawn. A week later, Gutek came to him. He stood beside him and began to repeat the movements. So-dang didn't object. 2 weeks later, there were 4 of them. Gutek, another dust-ranked member named Oh Jin-ho, a small boy with a squint whom no one would pair up with for sparring, and a girl named Moon Ha-in, also dust-ranked, who couldn't walk straight after falling off a mountain trail and injuring her back. So-dang didn't invite them. They came on their own. He simply went through his round. They just stood nearby. After 3 weeks, there were 6 of them, all pile rank, all those whom the sect had written off. Master Bae Han-il came to watch at dawn during the 4th week. He stood off to the side. He watched. 6 Pule rank disciples stood in a semicircle by the well and moved in silence, slowly, in unison. Their breathing could be heard in the morning stillness. Steady, deep. The 6 of them breathed as one. Bae Han-il stood there for 10 minutes. Then he left. He said nothing. But that same day, Seo-dae received permission to use the area by the well for morning practice. Officially, with the instructor's seal. Won Tae-il found out and was furious. He went to Bae Han-il and said that a leaf rank student had no right to teach other students, that it was against the rules, that it undermined the instructor's authority. Bae Han-il replied that Seo-dae wasn't teaching anyone. He was doing morning exercises. The other students were simply alongside him. Technically, there was no violation. Won Tae-il said that was just splitting hairs. Bae Han-il agreed. But he didn't revoke the permission. So-dong didn't know about this conversation. He found out later from Yoon So-ri, who had overheard it in the kitchen. Right now, he was preoccupied with something else. His body was changing faster than he'd expected. The second gate was functioning steadily. His chi absorption had reached 10%. 12 bamboo strikes in a single training session. Then 13. Then 15. The meridians in his arms were gradually clearing. Every evening, he lay in the Dantian lock posture and guided his chi through the channels. He found blockages. He didn't force his way through them. He softened them with his breath, like a river that doesn't break a rock but flows around it, slowly wearing it down. Of the 15 damaged areas, he cleared 3: the shoulder,
the left wrist, and the lower part of the right lung. 8 remained. Each cleared area brought progress, not sudden, but gradual. Qi flowed more freely. His body moved more easily. His sleep grew deeper. The voice in his head noted every step, an achievement. The left wrist meridian has been restored, plus 80, an achievement. For the first time in 3 years, normal qi circulation in the right lung, plus 100. In 3 years! This means that Suji's body had been damaged at least 3 years ago, since he was 13. Someone started beating this boy when he was 13 and didn't stop until the end. Su Deng worked with each of the 6 students individually, not during the morning rounds, in the evenings, one at a time. Gu Tak. His problem wasn't physical. He had a good body, strong, enduring, but his breathing would falter every time someone raised their voice at him. A reflex. A shout equals danger. Danger equals holding one's breath. Holding one's breath equals muscle tension. Muscle tension equals a failure in technique. So Don would have him stand in front of him and speak in a raised voice. He wasn't scolding him. He just spoke loudly. Gu Tak froze. His breath caught. So Don told him to keep breathing. Inhale, exhale, through the loud voice, through the shouting. Don't suppress the reaction. Breathe right next to her. The first time, Gu Tak couldn't do it. The second time, he held his breath for 10 seconds, then exhaled. The third time, for 5 seconds. A week later, he was breathing steadily, even when people were yelling at him. Not because he'd stopped being afraid, because he'd learned to breathe along with his fear. Oh, Jin-ho. His crossed eyes made him a target for ridicule, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was his coordination. His eyes sent 2 different images to his brain, and his body didn't know which one to trust. He stumbled even on level ground. He missed his punches. He couldn't catch the ball. Sodung blindfolded him and told him to practice his forms without sight, relying only on his body's sensations. On the first day, Oh Jin-ho fell every 3 steps. On the second day, every 5. A week later, he completed the entire routine blindfolded, without stumbling even once. His body had learned to trust itself rather than his eyes. When he took off the blindfold, his movements became cleaner. Not perfect, but cleaner. He stopped stumbling. He stopped missing his shots so often. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't last in practice. Manhwa. Back. An injury in the lumbar region. She walked hunched forward, and every step sent pain shooting down her left leg. Sodeng examined her. He placed his hand on her lower back and ran his qi along it. He sensed it. 2 vertebrae were misaligned, not by much, by millimeters, but enough to put pressure on the nerve. He couldn't realign the vertebrae. He wasn't a surgeon, but he could relieve the muscle spasm around them. He showed her an exercise. Lying on her back, knees to her chest, and slow rocking. Breathe into your lower back. Literally. Inhale so that your lower back expands, not your chest. Manhwa did this every evening. 10 days later, she was standing up straight. Not completely, but enough to walk without pain. She came to see him that evening and was silent for a minute. Then she said she'd thought she'd be hunchbacked for the rest of her life. Sodeng said she wouldn't be, but she had to do the exercise every day, without fail. She nodded and left. The next morning, she was the first one at the well, before dawn, before anyone else. The 4th month began with a visit.
A man in gray arrived on horseback, without insignia, no crest. He requested a meeting with the elders. He spoke quietly behind closed doors. Yoon Sori eavesdropped from the kitchen through the wall. A man from the Hae clan. No threats, a proposal. The Hae clan is willing to forget the incident at the tournament if the Silent Bamboo sect hands over their disciple, So Dan, to be trained at the clan school. They'll hand him over, like a piece of property. 2 of the 4 elders were in favor. It was a good way to get rid of an inconvenient disciple, and, at the same time, mend relations with the great clan. 2 were against it. Bae Han-il was one of them. He said that So Dung was a disciple of the sect, and the sect wouldn't sell him out. The votes were split 2-2. The decision was postponed. So Dan found out about it that evening and said nothing. He simply sat down by the well and began to breathe. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for 6 counts. The Dan Tien lock. Qi flowed slowly and warmly. He thought, if the sect decides to give him away, he'll leave on his own. Before that happens, he'll take those who want to go with him and leave. He's not an object. He wasn't an object in his previous life, and he won't be one in this one. But until a decision is made, he'll do what he knows how to do. Breathe, teach, wait. That night, he dreamed of the woman again. A white expanse, dark eyes. She showed him something new. Not a hand position, a movement. A slow step forward with a twist of the torso and a simultaneous exhale through both nostrils. The qi flowed not from the dantian, but from the feet, from the bottom up, like a tree drinking water. Suo Dan woke up and immediately repeated it. He stood barefoot on the cold floor. He took a step. He turned. He exhaled. The qi came from the earth. He felt it through his feet. Cold, heavy, different. Not like the qi in the air. Earthly qi. It rose up his legs and reached his abdomen. And there it met his internal qi. And the two became something third, denser, deeper. Suo Dan stood barefoot on the floor in the darkness and felt his body drinking in the power from beneath his feet. A voice rang out. Achievement. Contact with Earth Qi. Plus 150. A hint. This step is the first element of the lost form of the 10th way. The name? The step of rooting. The 10th way. Suo Dan stood there and felt the earth rumbling beneath his feet. The 5th month. Winter had come quickly and viciously. The mountains turned white overnight. The stream hadn't frozen, but the water had grown so cold that his hands went numb in 10 seconds. The buckets were covered with a crust of ice. The students were coughing and sniffling. The wind blew through the cracks in the walls of the barracks. So Dan plugged the cracks with rags and showed the students how to sleep curled up so that their body heat wouldn't escape. Basic rehabilitation. The fetal position. The blanket around the legs, not over the body. And 3 minutes of breathing exercises before bed, without fail. The Dantian lock. Qi warmed them from within. Not intensely, but enough to keep them from shivering all night. His 6 students had become more than just a morning exercise group. They stuck together, ate together, trained side by side. Gu Taik became their voice. The loud, confident boy who, 2 months ago, had frozen at the sound of a scream, now spoke for everyone when the instructors asked questions. Oh Jin-ho became their eyes. With or without his eye patch,
He saw things others didn't notice. Movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow around the corner, a person walking differently than usual. Moon Ha-in became their perseverance. She did the morning rounds every day, without fail, even when the temperature dropped so low that the water in the bucket froze. She stood by the well, barefoot in the snow, and breathed. So-dung wanted to stop her. Then he saw that her toes weren't turning blue. Chi was warming her feet. She'd taught herself. He hadn't shown her. She simply breathed so long and so deeply that the chi went where it needed to go. Down, into her legs, into her feet, into the ground. So-dung watched her and thought that perhaps the 10th way didn't need a teacher. Perhaps it simply happens when a person breathes honestly enough. The 3rd gate opened during the 1st week of winter, at night. So-dan lay on the bunk and performed the Dantian lock. Qi flowed through the familiar channels, his abdomen, his back, his arms, his legs, his usual evening practice. And suddenly, the channel continued further, from the abdomen upward, not along the back as before, down the center, through the chest, through the throat, toward the head. So Dan froze. The chi reached the point between his eyebrows and stopped. It pulsed. It pressed. It didn't hurt. It was persistent, like a knock on the door. So Dan exhaled. The door opened. The 3rd gate. Chi surged into his head, and the world changed. He closed his eyes and saw. Not with his eyes, with something else. Contours, lines, streams. He saw the chi all around him. Warm threads in the air, cold currents in the earth beneath the floor, the faint pulsations of the sleeping students on the neighboring bunks. Each had its own brightness, its own frequency, its own color. Gu Taik was a warm orange. O Jin Ho was a greenish hue. Moon Ha-in was a steady yellow. So Dai-ung opened his eyes. The outlines vanished. He closed them. They returned. Chi vision. The 3rd gate granted Chi vision. He lay in the darkness and laughed quietly. His voice rang out. An achievement. The opening of the 3rd gate. Plus 1,500. An ability. Chi vision. A radius of 10 steps. It expands with practice. Chi vision changed everything. Now, when he looked at a patient, he saw more than just the body. He saw the meridians, blockages, damage, leaks. He saw where the chi flowed freely and where it stood still, like water behind a dam. He saw young Sori and finally understood why she was considered to have empty breathing. She had gates, closed, not absent, specifically closed, like a door locked from the outside. Someone or something had sealed her 1st gate when she was a child. A fever, or treatment for the fever. The healer who told her not to breathe deeply might not have been ignorant. Perhaps he deliberately closed her gates so the fever wouldn't burn out her meridians. He saved her life, but locked away her potential. So Dan looked at the golden lock on her dantian and thought. He could try to open it, but not now. He was too weak. One wrong move and he would tear her channels instead of freeing them. Winter brought not only cold, but also guests. The White Crane sect had sent a delegation, 3 elders and 10 disciples. Formally, it was a friendly visit, an exchange of herbs and joint meditation. In reality, they had come to see Sodan. Yun Sori brought the news from the kitchen. Ching Wei-ming, an elder of the White Crane sect, had personally inquired about the boy who had defeated He's heir without striking a blow. So Dan had thought of avoiding them. Not to show his face, but Bei Han Il came to him and quietly said that the White Crane sect was not an enemy, that they were one of the few outer sects with real influence, that their support could save Silent Bamboo from the He clan. So Deng asked what was required of him. Bei Han Il said simply to be himself. So Deng thought that this was the most baffling advice he'd ever received in this world. The meeting took place in the sect's main hall. So Deng entered and immediately sensed with his chi vision that Elder Ching Wei-ming was unlike the others. His chi was of a different quality, pure, silvery, calm as a mountain lake. The 6th gate, perhaps the 7th. So Deng couldn't tell for sure, but this man was stronger than anyone he had ever met, including He Zhongwan. Ching Wei-ming sat on a cushion, sipping tea, a short, gray-haired man with kind eyes. He looked at Sodan and smiled. Then he said he was glad to finally meet the boy everyone in the southern region was talking about. Sodan bowed. Ching Wei-ming asked him to sit down. Sodan sat down. Ching Wei-ming was silent for a minute. He sipped his tea. Then he said he wanted to ask one question. Sodan nodded. Ching Wei-ming asked, "How do you know how to breathe? Not how everyone else breathes, but how you breathe." Sodan remained silent. The question was simple, but the answer was more complicated than his entire new life. He said he'd taught himself. Ching Wei-ming shook his head. He didn't believe him. Then he said there was a tablet in the archives of the White Crane sect, an old one, a very old one. It describes a path that requires no talent, only perseverance, only breathing, only attention to every step. This path was destroyed by the founders of the 9 great clans because it rendered talent meaningless. Ching Wei-min looked Sodan straight in the eyes and quietly said that what Sodan was doing resembled this path. Sodan felt his heart beating faster. He forced himself to exhale. In 6 counts, his heart slowed. He asked what this path was called. Ching Wei-ming said, "The 10th path." Sodan walked back to the barracks, his hands cold despite the chi. The 10th path. A name the system had mentioned once. The step of rooting. The first element of the lost form of the 10th path. A coincidence. Or perhaps not. He didn't know. But now he knew what he was looking for. And he knew he wasn't alone. The 6th month of winter turned out to be the hardest, not because of the cold, because the people. The 2 elders who wanted to hand Sodan over to the He clan didn't stop after the failed vote. They acted more discreetly. They began cutting back on Sodan's resources. He was transferred back to water-carrying duties, officially because of a shortage of workers in the winter. In reality, to take away his training time. His 6 disciples were forbidden from going on their morning rounds. Officially, it was because of the freezing temperatures. Gatherings by the well were a health hazard. Han Minju received a warning from an elder that she was wasting too many herbs on dust-rank disciples who were of no use to the sect. Sodan listened to all this and breathed. Steadily. Inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 6. Dantian lock. He wasn't angry. Anger shuts down the mind. The mind provides experience. Experience brings growth. He couldn't afford to be angry. Instead, he adapted. The morning circuit was moved to the barracks. It was cramped. It was cold. But there was enough room for 7 people. So Deng modified the movements. He eliminated the wide rotations. He added static poses. He froze in a stance. Breathe. He froze in a bend. Breathe. Each pose lasted 10 breaths. Quieter. More inconspicuous. But just as effective. Carrying water in the winter was harder than in the summer. Water is heavier when it's cold. Fingers won't bend. Feet slip on the ice. So Dan carried the buckets and counted. 2 steps, inhale. 3 steps, exhale. The same rhythm as on the first day. But now every step drew chi from the earth. The grounding step. He integrated it into his walking with the rocker arm. Every step with his bare feet on the cold trail drew chi from beneath the stones. Cold, heavy, earthy chi. It rose up his legs, mingled with his internal chi, and settled in the dantian. 20 walks a day, 600 steps one way, 12,000 steps a day. Each one mindful, each one with grounding. The voice in his head rang out almost continuously. +1, +1, +1. By the middle of the month, something happened that So-Dan hadn't expected. Yoon Sori came to him in the evening with hands red from the cold and said she felt something strange in her stomach. A warmth. She hadn't done anything special. She'd just been breathing, as he'd taught her, every day. Her stomach pushed against her palm. Her ribs opened up. The exhale is longer than the inhale. 2 months, every day, without a break. And now it's warm inside. So-Dan asked her to sit down and closed his eyes. Chi vision. He looked at her dantian and froze. The lock on her first gate was glowing. Not the cold, golden light of sealing. Warm, pulsating. The lock hadn't disappeared, but it was changing, softening, like ice under the spring sun. Yoon Sori wasn't breaking through it. She didn't even know it was there. She was simply breathing so deeply and so consistently that her own chi had begun to press against the lock from within. So-Dan opened his eyes and looked at her. A little girl with a twitch in her left eyelid, who, for 7 years, had been afraid to take a full breath. Who, 2 months ago, didn't know what a diaphragm was. Who had advanced 1 millimeter every day and hadn't missed a single day. He told her that was good, that she should keep going, that she didn't need to change a thing. Just breathe the way she was breathing. Yoon Sori nodded. Then she quietly asked what that meant. So-Dan thought for a moment. Then he told her the truth, that her gate wasn't broken, that they were locked, that the lock was melting, that if she kept breathing like that for another month or 2, it would melt away completely, and then her first gate would open. Hers, the one who breathes emptiness. The girl who had been written off from day 1. Yoon Sori sat quietly. Then her tick twitched 4 times in a row. Then she stood up and left, without saying a word. The next morning, she was at the well before dawn, barefoot, in the snow, breathing. The 4th gate came a week later, not a click like before, a wave. So Dan stood on the trail with buckets at dawn. A step, grounding, a breath, and suddenly her whole body hummed. Qi surged from the earth like a river bursting its banks, down her legs, down my stomach, down my back, through my arms, up my throat, into my head, and further, upward, to the crown of my head, where the final point of the fourth channel was. The fourth gate. It opened from the earth, not from my breath. So Dan dropped the buckets. Water spilled across the trail. He stood there and felt his body drinking in the world, the air, the earth, everything at once. A voice rang out, long and quiet. Achievement. Opening of the fourth gate through the Earth Channel. Plus 2,000. Note: non-standard method of opening. Earth Chi is integrated into the meridian system. Side effect: increased sensitivity to earth vibrations. Radius of 30 steps. So Dan lifted the buckets, refilled them, moved on. 2 steps, inhale. 3 steps, exhale. His feet felt every stone on the trail, every tree root, every underground stream. The world beneath his feet was alive and full of qi, and he drank from it with every step. That evening, Bei Han-il summoned him. A quiet office. Tea. Bei Han-il closed the door and said that the situation had changed. The He clan had sent a second message. Not a proposal, a demand. If the sect did not hand over So-dan voluntarily, the He clan would revoke the trade agreement under which the sect received winter herbs from their territory. Without those herbs, a third of the disciples would not survive the winter. Bei Han-il spoke calmly, but his breathing gave him away. 14 breaths per minute instead of the usual 10. He was nervous. So-dang remained silent. Then he asked how much time he had. Bei Han-il said the council would make its decision in a month, in early spring. So-dang nodded. A month. A lot can be done in a month. He stood up and bowed. Bei Han-il stopped him at the door and quietly said he wouldn't hand him over, no matter what the council decided. So-dung turned around. Bei Han-il was looking at him with an expression So-dung had never seen before. Not that of a mentor toward a student, but of one human being toward another. So-dung bowed more deeply and left. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk and thought. A month. He needed to either become so valuable to the sect that they wouldn't give him away, or become strong enough to leave on his own and take with him those he couldn't abandon. Yun So-ri, Han Min-ju, Gu Tek, Oh Jin-ho, Moon Ha-in. 6 people, 7 including him. He closed his eyes and saw with his qi vision how they were sleeping in the neighboring barracks. The warm pulsations of living people. His people. Not by the right of blood, not by the right of strength, by the right of breath. He had taught them to breathe. They had taught him not to be alone. So-dung lay there, breathing. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6. The Dantian Lock. The earth beneath the floor hummed quietly and steadily, like the heartbeat of the world. He did not yet know that in a month everything would change, that the council's decision would be unnecessary, that the He clan would come not with a letter, but with weapons, that winter would end not with spring, but with blood. But he knew one thing. He would not stop. +1, +1, +1.
100. Just 100 times 1. And he knows how to count. Spring arrived 3 days early. Snow melted into muddy streams along the trails. The trees were sprouting their first buds. And along with spring came Che Un-hye. So Deng saw her for the first time on the training grounds. A tall 22-year-old woman with a long braid and an intense gaze. She stood by the wall, watching the leaves practice their forms. Her chi trail was strange. So Deng closed his eyes and looked with his chi vision. 4 open gates, a powerful, pure flow, but cold, blue and white, and a constriction in the center of her chest. A dense knot of chi that wouldn't budge, like a stone in a river. Everything flows around it, yet it stands still. So Deng opened his eyes. This woman was stronger than any instructor in the sect, and yet her chi wasn't working. The flow was powerful, but lifeless, like a river that flows but doesn't turn a mill. Yun Sori told him her story that evening. Che Un-hye had been a mentor to the outer disciples 3 years ago, the best in the sect. 4 open gates by the age of 19. The ice heart technique, a family style based on suppressing emotions. The colder the heart, the stronger the chi. 3 years ago, a senior disciple was beating up a boy from Pure, not for discipline, for fun. Yun-hye intervened. She broke the senior disciple's arm. The Council of Elders stripped her of her rank for violating the hierarchy. They took away her title as a mentor. She was reassigned to menial tasks. Since then, she had lived within the sect like a shadow. She didn't train, she didn't teach, she didn't develop. The 4th gate lay dormant. So Deng listened and understood. The ice heart technique requires inner coldness, but Yun-hye's heart is warm. She intervened because she couldn't help but intervene, because it pained her to watch. And that warmth destroyed her technique. She couldn't be cold and still remain herself. So she chose herself, and paid for it with 3 years of emptiness. So Deng found her the next morning by the stables. She was grooming a horse, silently, methodically. He stood beside her and said he could see her chi. She didn't turn around. She said she didn't care. So Deng said there was a knot in the center of her chest that was blocking her chi. She stopped her hand. She turned around. She looked at him. A heavy, cold gaze. She said she knew that this knot had appeared the day she broke the senior student's arm, that it hadn't gone away since then, that 3 doctors had examined her and all said the same thing. A conflict between technique and nature. Technique requires cold. Nature provides warmth. They clashed and formed a knot. The solution? Either kill the warmth and restore the cold, or leave it as is and forget about growth. She chose the latter. So Dan remained silent. Then he said there was a third option. She smirked. She said that 3 masters higher in rank than her had said there was no third option. So Dan said that masters are wrong when they look at technology instead of looking at the person. Un-hye looked at him for a long time. Then she said she had nothing to lose. He worked with her for a week, 2 hours every evening. At first, he observed, with chi vision. He studied the knot. It wasn't just a blockage, it was a conflict between 2 streams. The cold stream of technique flowed from top to bottom. The warm stream of her nature flowed from bottom to top. They met in her chest and clashed. Neither could prevail. The result?
a dead zone. So Dan thought about it for 3 days. Then he realized, you can't remove the conflict. You have to change the direction. If the warm flow moves not toward the cold one, but alongside it, not from the bottom up, but from the top down, then they won't clash, but will merge. Warm and cold. Not ice, not fire, cool water. He showed her, slowly, step by step. Breathing that begins at the crown of the head, not from the abdomen. Inhale through the nose and imagine the air entering through the crown. It descends downward, through the throat, through the chest, into the abdomen, into the legs, into the feet. Exhale through the feet into the ground. Everything down, everything in one direction. Warmth together with cold. Eun-hye tried it. On the first inhale, the knot twitched. On the third, it began to turn. Slowly. Like a millstone that hadn't moved for 3 years and finally shifted. On the 10th breath, Eun-hye opened her eyes, and they were wet. She didn't say anything. She stood up and left. The next morning, she was at the well, along with the 6 others. The 7th. She stood behind everyone and breathed from top to bottom. The knot was spinning. Slowly, but it was turning. 3 days later, everything came crashing down. So Deng was returning with water along the morning trail when his earth sensitivity picked up a vibration. Many feet, heavy ones, in armor, heading toward the sect from the eastern pass. Not 10 people, not 20, more. So Den dropped the buckets and ran. He found Bae Han-il near the main hall. He told him that armed men were approaching the sect from the east. Bae Han-il turned pale. The east was the direction of the He clan. The council's decision was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The clan didn't wait. An hour later, 40 warriors in black armor, bearing the He clan crest on their breastplates, appeared on the road leading to the sect's gates. At the front was a palanquin. Inside the palanquin was He Jo-young, the clan elder. Behind the palanquin was He Jung-won. Sodong watched them from the roof of the crayfish, with chi vision. 40 warriors, mid-level 3rd gate, 4 at the 4th gate, He Jong-wen at the 5th. The elder. Sodong looked and then looked away. The elder blazed like the sun. 7th gate, perhaps the 8th. Compared to him, the entire Silent Bamboo sect was like candles before a bonfire. Elder He Jiao-yun entered the sect's gates of the sect, and the air changed. Sodong felt it in his feet. The ground beneath the elder's feet gave way. Not physically, the chi in the earth receded from him like water from a hot stone. This man was so powerful that his presence warped the world around him. 4 elders of the Silent Bamboo sect came out to greet him. 2 of them were the ones who had wanted to hand Sodong over. They bowed deeply. The other 2 stood upright. Bae Han-il was among them. His breathing was steady, 10 breaths per minute. He wasn't afraid. Or perhaps he was afraid, but he wouldn't let fear disrupt his rhythm. Sodong respected him for this more than for anything else. Ha Jo-young didn't waste time on formalities. He sat down in the main hall. He accepted the tea. He took a single sip. Then he set the cup down and said that the Ha clan was taking Sodong's disciple. He wasn't asking, taking, as compensation for the humiliation of the heir. Refusal would be regarded as a declaration of war, and for the outer sect, War with the great clan meant death. The elder spoke calmly. There was no threat in his voice. It was a fact, like the weather. It will rain tomorrow. The sect will be destroyed. It was the same thing. Two of the sect's elders immediately agreed. The third remained silent. Bae-han-il said no, quietly and evenly. He said that the Silent Bamboo sect does not trade in disciples. He Jo-yun looked at him as if he were a fly. Then he smiled and said he respected his courage. But courage without strength is suicide. Bae-han-il replied that perhaps so, but it was his suicide and he alone would decide when and how. So-dung stood outside the hall door and listened. Han Min-ju was beside him. Choi Un-hye was beside him. Yoon So-ri was beside him. He had made his decision before the elder had finished speaking. He entered the hall. Everyone fell silent. Ha Jo-yoon turned his head and looked at him. His eyes were old and yellow, like a lizard's. So-dung bowed. Then he said he was grateful to the Ha clan for their interest in his humble self, that he didn't want the sect that had accepted him to suffer because of him, and that he proposed to resolve the matter according to custom, a duel. If a representative of the He clan wins, So-dung will leave voluntarily. If So-dung wins, the clan will back down. Ha Jo-young smirked. He asked who So-dung wanted to fight. A warrior. The heir. So-dung said he wanted to fight the heir, Heo Jun-won, one-on-one, until one of them surrendered. Heo Jo-young was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said he agreed. Heo Jun-won, who had been standing behind the elder, stepped forward. His face was stony, but his breathing was faster than it had been during the tournament. 16 breaths per minute. He was nervous, or angry, or both. He had been preparing for this fight for half a year. The sect's courtyard, noon. The sun shone through the clouds. 40 warriors of the He clan stood along one wall. The sect's disciples stood along the other. So-dung stepped into the center of the courtyard. Ha Jong-won stepped forward to face him. He had changed over the past half a year. Broad-shouldered, a steely look in his eyes. On his arms were silver bracers engraved with techniques. His chi was denser, purer. He had trained a lot, specifically for this fight. So-dung looked at him with chi vision. The fifth gate, stable, a powerful flow. But So-dung saw it. The right side of his diaphragm was clenched. That very one. The one he'd noticed at the tournament. Jun-won hadn't corrected it. 6 months, and he still hadn't. Because no one had told him. Or maybe they did, but he didn't listen. Pride. The heir to the great clan doesn't take advice from a dust-rank boy. He Jo-young raised his hand, lowered it. The fight began. Jung-won didn't wait. He struck immediately, quickly, powerfully. His palm, charged with chi, sliced through the air. So-dung sensed the blow through his earth sensitivity before he saw it. The vibration of Jung-won's foot at the moment of thrust, half a second before the strike. So-dung moved, not to the side, downward. The rooting step. His foot into the ground, chi rising from beneath his feet. Heavy, solid. He became heavier, more stable. Jung-won's strike passed over his head. So-dang rose and responded, not with a strike, with an exhalation. a long, steady exhalation in a rhythm that didn't match Jung-won's. The same technique as at the tournament. But Jung-won was ready. He blocked his ears with a technique. Literally. Dense qi covered his head like a helmet. He couldn't hear the other's breathing. He couldn't feel it. So-deng saw this and understood. It wouldn't work. Jung-won had been studying. He'd found a countermeasure. So-deng smirked inwardly. Fine. That meant he'd have to do it differently. Jung-won attacked with a flurry. 5 strikes. Fast, precise. So-deng kept his distance as short as possible. Each time, his earthly sensitivity gave him a half-second advantage. But Jung-won was faster. The 3rd strike hit his shoulder. Pain. Intense. So-deng exhaled through it. The 4th strike hit his chest. So-deng blocked it with his forearm. His arm burned. Jung-won's qi was like boiling water. The 5th strike. So-deng didn't have time to dodge. Jung-won's palm slammed into his stomach. So-deng was sent flying 5 steps back. He fell. He rolled across the rocks. His ribs, old fractures, howled. His mouth filled with a coppery taste. He lay on the rocks and felt the earth pulsing beneath his back. The voice in his head was silent. No achievements, only pain. So-deng inhaled, slowly, counting to 4. He stood up, slowly. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Blood, a little. Jung-won stood 10 paces away and waited. His qi helmet glowed silver. So-deng couldn't disrupt his rhythm with sound. But rhythm isn't transmitted only through the ears. It's transmitted through the ground. So-deng assumed a stance. Not a bow stance, a different one. Feet wider apart. Feet firmly planted on the ground. Arms lowered. The dantian lock engaged while standing. And he began to breathe. Not just breathe. With every exhale, he sent the energy downward, through his feet, into the ground. His qi entered the stones and radiated out in circles, like ripples from a stone thrown into water. The circles reached Jung-won, touching his feet. Jung-won didn't notice. His helmet protected his ears, but not his feet. So Dan's qi flowed across the ground and embraced his feet. Gently, quietly, like the surf. Inhale. A wave came. Exhale. The wave receded. A rhythm, not through the air, through the ground. Jung-won's body began to respond. Not immediately. 20 seconds later, his feet shifted slightly. They adjusted to the wave. 30 seconds later, his knees bent slightly to a rhythm that wasn't his own. 40 seconds later, his breathing began to falter. Again, just like at the tournament. But this time, he understood. He looked down. He saw a faint glow on the stones, and his eyes widened. He tried to jump back. He jumped, but the rhythm had already seeped into his body. His landing was uneven. His next strike missed. His qi helmet flickered and vanished. So Dan stepped forward. 1 step of grounding. The earth rumbled. Jung-won staggered. So-deng exhaled into his face. A long, steady, warm breath. And at the same time, he sent a wave through the ground. From above and below. 2 rhythms. Both his. Both foreign to Jung-won. The body of the He clan's heir rebelled. His qi followed an unfamiliar path. His technique died. He stood in the middle of the courtyard, unable to strike, defend himself, or even breathe in his own way. So Deng stood before him and breathed, calmly, steadily. 4 breaths in, 6 breaths out. Jungwon sank to one knee, not from pain, from helplessness. His eyes were wet, not tears, confusion. So Deng leaned toward him and said quietly, so that only Junwon could hear, that the right side of his diaphragm was constricted since he was 10, that it could be treated in half a year, that he should ask someone for help. Junwon looked up at him. Then he lowered his head. So-dung straightened up and turned to He Jo-young. The elder was sitting in a chair, his face expressionless. 10 seconds of silence. Then He Jo-young stood up, and for the first time all day, he took a full, deep breath. All the way. So Deng saw this with his chi vision. The elder's diaphragm lowered completely. His ribs expanded. His lungs filled to the brim. The elder looked at So Deng, and there was something new in his yellow eyes. Not anger, not respect, interest. He turned and walked toward the palanquin. 40 warriors followed him. He Jong-wen rose from his knee and followed. At the gate, he turned around. He looked at So Deng. So Deng nodded at him. Jong-wen turned away and left. After the He clan's departure, the Silent Bamboo sect split irrevocably. The 2 elders who had wanted to hand over So-dan declared that he had brought disaster upon the sect, that the He clan would return, that next time they would come with an army, not a delegation, that So-dan must leave of his own accord for the safety of everyone. Baek Han-il objected. The 4th elder remained silent. The votes were again split 2-2. But now the atmosphere was different. The disciples were divided. Half were afraid and wanted peace and quiet. Half had witnessed the duel and wanted to be like So-dung. The split ran along the lines of fear. So-dung didn't wait. On the 3rd day after the He clan's departure, he went to Baek Han-il and said he was leaving. Voluntarily, not because he was afraid. Because if he stayed, the sect would fall apart. And a torn-apart sect wouldn't survive even without the He clan. Baek Han-il was silent for a long time. Then he asked where he was going. So-dung said to a village at the foot of the mountain, to the apothecary Park Yeon-soo. There's an empty house on the outskirts there. He could live and teach there. Not a sect, a homestead, an open school for those who have nowhere else to go. Baek Han-il asked who would go with him. So-dung said whoever wanted to. He wouldn't call anyone. He wouldn't try to persuade anyone. He'd simply leave in the morning and see who followed. In the morning, he walked out of the sect's gate with a bag slung over his shoulder. Inside the bag were clothes, the ointment from Han Min-ju, 3 small bags of herbs, and a small board with notes on breathing exercises. He didn't look back. He walked down the path. 2 steps, inhale, 3 steps, exhale. After 50 steps, he heard another set of footsteps. Light, quick. Yoon So-ri. She was carrying a bundle of food and a mess kit strapped to her back. After 100 steps, heavy footsteps. Che Un-hye. 2 swords and scabbards on her back. After 150, Han Min-ju, with a basket of herbs that weighed more than she did. After 200, Gu Taik and Oh Jin-ho, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. After 250, manhwa. Her back was straight. She walked without pain. Behind her were 4 more, students of the pill rank whom So-dung knew from his morning rounds. And behind them, So-dung stopped. He turned around. Bai Hanil was bringing up the rear. A sack on his shoulder, a mentor's badge on his belt. He looked at So-dung and said one word. "Let's go." So-dung stood on the trail and counted. 13 people. He was the 14th. None of them were fighters in the traditional sense. A herbalist with asthma, a girl who couldn't breathe 2 months ago, a boy with a squint, a girl with a bad back, a woman whose technique was blocked, an old mentor who chose his students over his career. And him, a breathing instructor from San Francisco in the body of a 16-year-old orphan. So Dan turned and walked on. 2 steps, inhale. 3 steps, exhale. 14 people followed him, and they all breathed in unison. The village greeted them warily. The apothecary, Park Yon-soo, welcomed them with tea and rice. His daughter, Silgi, stood by the door. Her cough had been cut in half over the past 3 months. She was no longer coughing up blood. The pharmacist kept his word and told the neighbors. 3 families from the village had already come to see So-dan that winter. A grandmother with shortness of breath, a man who had been limping since a fall, and a child with nightmares that would wake him up gasping for air. So Dan helped each of them, for free. The village remembered. The empty house on the outskirts turned out to be half ruined. The roof was leaking. The walls were cracked. The floor was dirt. So Dan looked at it and said he'd seen worse. Han Min-ju snorted and said she hadn't. But she picked up a broom. By the evening of the first day, the roof had been patched. By the evening of the second, the walls had been plastered with clay. By the evening of the third, the yard around the house had been cleared. It wasn't big, but it was big enough for a morning patrol. So-dang drove a post into the ground to practice his strikes. He wrapped it in straw. He hung a small sign above the entrance. The Small Steps Courtyard. The first week at the Small Steps Courtyard was tough. There wasn't much food. There wasn't much firewood. There was enough water, but it was a long way to fetch it. So Dan assigned responsibilities. Han Min-ju was in charge of health and herbs. Che Un-hye was in charge of security and night watch. Gu Tek was in charge of housekeeping. Yoon So-ri was in charge of the kitchen. Oh Jin-ho was in charge of surveillance and intelligence. Moon Ha-in was in charge of the daily training regimen. Bae Ha-neil was in charge of teaching combat forms. So-dung was in charge of breathing exercises. Every morning before dawn. Morning routine. 14 people in a semicircle. 7 movements. 70 cycles. 12 minutes of silence and breathing. Then breakfast. Then work. Then training. Then dinner. Then breathing by the well. Then sleep. Rhythm. Schedule. Order. So Dan wasn't building a cult. He was building a clinic. A place where people are healed. 2 weeks later, the first patients arrived from the village, then from the neighboring village, then from the village beyond the pass. An elderly woman who hadn't been able to climb the stairs without getting short of breath for 20 years. So Dan corrected her breathing in 3 sessions. An old man with shaking hands. So Dan showed him how to breathe in coordination with movement, and his hands stopped shaking during practice. A 10-year-old boy with a stutter. So Dan taught him to breathe before each word. A short inhale, the word on the exhale. The boy spoke clearly for the first time in his life. People brought whatever they could: rice, vegetables, cloth, a coin. So Dan didn't set a price. He took whatever was given. The farmstead began to come alive. Not richly, but alive. 2 months at the farmstead, late spring. So Dan stood in the courtyard at dawn and counted. 22 people in a semicircle. 14 of their own and 8 newcomers. 3 girls from the village, aged 12 to 15, who had come to study. 2 former students of the Silent Bamboo sect who left later. A 30-year-old man from a neighboring village who had been a hunter until he broke his leg, and an old cook from the sect. She arrived a week after the others. She said that in the new kitchen, without Yoon Sori, everything was burning, and that after 20 years at the stove, her back hurt so much she couldn't sleep. Sodang took her under his wing. He showed her how to breathe into her lower back. 3 days later, she was sleeping. A week later, she was feeding 22 people and grumbling that the pots were too small. Yoon Sori opened the first gate during the 6th week of the courtyard. Morning. Dawn. She stood by the well and breathed, just like every day. Inhale. Her abdomen pushes against her palm. Her ribs expand. The exhale is longer than the inhale. And in an instant, the lock on her dantian melted away. Sodang saw this with his chi vision. A golden light flashed and vanished. In its place, a flower bloomed, warm, bright. Chi surged into Yoon Sori like water into an empty channel. She shuddered. Her eyes widened. She pressed her palm against her stomach and felt it. Warmth, alive, real. Chi. Her chi. For the first time in her 15 years of life. She stood there, breathing, and tears streamed silently down her cheeks. The twitch in her left eyelid stopped, completely. Sodang stood 10 paces away and watched. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He just stood there. This was her moment, not his. Yoon Sori breathed, deeply, fully, without fear. For the first time in her life, she inhaled to the very end, and the world flowed into her. Choi Eun-hye opened the 5th gate that same week. Her knot had finally come undone. Warm and cold currents merged into one. Not ice, not fire. Cool, flowing water. A new technique. Not the icy heart. Something else. She didn't yet know what to call it, but when she stepped out into the courtyard and performed the form for the first time in 3 years, her movements were different. Smooth. Powerful. Without jerks. Without tension. Chi flowed through her like a river through a valley. She finished the form and stood there for a minute. Then she turned to Sodang and said he was right, that a third option existed, that her former teacher had lied. Not out of malice, he simply didn't know that warmth could be a strength rather than a weakness. Sodang nodded. For the first time in 3 years, Eun-hye smiled. Not a wide one, just the corner of her lips. But it was a smile. At the beginning of summer, a letter arrived. Not from the He clan, from the White Crane sect. Elder Ching Wei-ming invited Sodang for a conversation. Not at the sect, at a neutral location, a mountain temple on a pass. Sodang thought it over for 2 days. Then he went. Alone. Che Eun-hye wanted to go with him. He said it wasn't necessary. That if Ching Wei-ming wanted to harm him, he wouldn't have written a letter. Eun-hye gave him a heavy look, but backed down. The mountain temple. Stone walls. the scent of incense. Qing Weiming sat on the terrace and gazed at the clouds. Suo Deng sat down beside him. They were silent for 5 minutes. Then Qing Weiming spoke. He said that the tablet in the White Crane sect's archives contained not only a description of the 10th path, it contained a name. The name of the last woman who had mastered that path. Su Mei Lin. Su. Like Su Deng's last name. Like the last name of the boy in whose body he lived. Su Dan sat there, his heart pounding faster. He forced himself to breathe. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6. Qing Weimin continued. Su Mei Lin was the mother of a boy named Su Zhe. She had died 6 years ago. Before her death, she had done something no one had done in 300 years. She had bound her qi to her son's meridians. Not just qi, knowledge, memory, a fragment of the 10th path. Like a seed planted in the ground, waiting for rain. Su Deng sat quietly. The woman from his dreams. Dark eyes. A smile not with her lips, but with her eyes. The Dantian lock. The step of rooting. All from her. Qing Weimin turned to him and said, "You have become the rain." So Deng asked what he wanted. Qing Weimin said he wanted to see the 10th path return to the world, not as a secret, not as a weapon, but as a teaching, open for everyone. So Dan looked at the clouds and thought of the cook who hadn't been able to sleep for 20 years because of back pain. Of Yun Sori, who had been afraid to breathe for 7 years. Of Moon Ha-in, who thought she would be hunchbacked until she died. He said that this was exactly what he wanted. Qing Weiming nodded. Then he pulled a scroll out of his sleeve, old, worn, and placed it in front of So Deng. He said it was a copy of the tablet, the full text, the first and only description of the 10th path in the last 300 years. So Deng took the scroll. His hands didn't tremble. He knew what he was holding. Not a weapon, not a secret. Instructions on how to heal people on a continental scale. Back at the courtyard, he unrolled the scroll. Han Minju was sitting next to him. Un He stood behind him. Yun Sori was brewing tea. Bei Hanil was reading over his shoulder. The text was old and damaged in places, but the essence was clear. The 10th way is not a technique, it is a principle. Qi belongs to the world, not to a person. Air, earth, water, everything contains qi. A person does not generate qi, they channel it, like a riverbed. The cleaner the riverbed, the more qi flows through it. The purity of the riverbed does not depend on talent. It depends on perseverance, on mindfulness, on paying attention to every breath and every step. The 9 great clans destroyed this way because it rendered innate superiority meaningless. If anyone can become a conduit for qi simply by breathing correctly, then why do we need clans? Why do we need secret schools? Why do we need a hierarchy of talent? So Dan read and learned. That was all he did, from day 1. Mindful breathing, mindful steps, mindful exhalation through pain. The Small Steps Journal System. 1 point for every mindful action. This is the 10th path. He had been walking it since his first breath in this world, without knowing, without understanding, simply because it was the only thing he knew how to do. Summer was in full swing. The greenery on the mountains had grown thick and dark. The air was warm and heavy with qi. 26 people lived at the small steps courtyard. Every morning before dawn, they would go out into the courtyard. A semicircle. Silence. Steam from their mouths in the cool morning air. So Dan stood in the center. He didn't demonstrate the technique. He didn't give orders. He simply spoke. Inhale for a count of 4. Feel your lower ribs rise, not your shoulders, your ribs. Exhale for a count of 6. Longer. Even longer. 26 people were breathing. An elderly cook with a bad back who hadn't been able to sleep 3 months ago. A lame stable hand who had come from a neighboring village with a cane and now walked without it. 3 girls from the village who had giggled during their first class, but now stood with straight backs and their eyes closed. A hunter with a broken leg who was learning to walk again. Yoon Sori, who was no longer afraid to breathe in fully. They were all breathing. Deeply. Steadily. Together. So Dan stood there and sensed it. With his chi vision. 26 warm pulsations. Each had its own color, its own rhythm, its own pattern. But they were all connected. Not physically, through their breath. When 26 people breathe in unison, something happens to the air around them. Chi begins to move, not like the wind, like a tide. Slow, powerful, unstoppable. It comes from all directions, from the earth, from the trees, from a mountain stream, from the air itself. And it enters everyone who breathes, drop by drop, grain by grain. The 10th way, not a technique for a lone practitioner, shared breathing. So Dan finally understood. So Ju's mother had not left him a weapon. She had left him a seed. And it had sprouted not just within him alone. It had sprouted within everyone. A road leading east ran past the courtyard. Riders and caravans traveled along it. That day, a master of the great clan rode along it. So Dan did not know his name. He did not know his rank. But with his chi vision, he saw how the riders stopped his horse at the gate. He wept. He stood and watched. 26 people were breathing in a semicircle. Not a single one of them was a fighter. A cook, a stable hand, children, a herbalist, a cripple. And they breathed better than half the disciples of his clan. The master stood at the gate for 10 heartbeats. Then he took a breath himself. A full one. A deep one. Right to the bottom. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Lightness. Simple human lightness. He stood there for another minute. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. But so Dan saw it. His breathing had changed. It had been 14 breaths per minute. Now it was 12. The master had taken 2 extra breaths of peace with him. After his morning practice, So Dan went out onto the trail beyond the village, alone. He needed to think. The 4th gate was functioning steadily. Chi flowed freely. His earth sensitivity had expanded to 50 paces. His chi vision reached 20. He was stronger than most disciples of the inner sex. And yet, he knew that his strength wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was down below, in the village. 26 people who, every day, breathed 1 millimeter deeper. Every day, without fail. One more. One more. One more. He sat down on a rock by the cliff's edge. The mountains stretched toward the horizon. Clouds drifted slowly. The air was full of qi. Su Deng closed his eyes and breathed in, deeply, fully, consciously. And he heard a voice, not the one that counts achievements, another one, warm, alive, the voice of So Mei Lin, the voice of the mother of the boy whose body had become his own. She said one word, "Thank you." Su Deng opened his eyes. There was no one in front of him, only mountains and clouds. But the warmth in his chest grew stronger. And he understood. Her qi was letting him go. The seed had sprouted. The tree stands. It no longer needs watering. She is leaving, to the place where mothers go when their children grow up. Su Deng sat on a rock and breathed. In for 4, out for 6. There were no tears. There was warmth. A simple, quiet warmth of gratitude. He returned to the courtyard around noon. They were waiting for him in the courtyard. Everyone. Han Minju sat on the porch, sorting through herbs. She hadn't coughed in 9 weeks. Not once. Her breath was clear and deep. She looked at him and said a letter had arrived from the village beyond the mountain. 5 more people want to study. 2 elderly men with shortness of breath, a woman who gave birth and can't catch her breath, a boy with asthma, a girl they call the one who breathes into nothingness. So Dan nodded. Han Minju said they'd soon need a second house. So Dan said they'd build one. She snorted and said he made it sound so easy. He said it wasn't easy, but it was doable. 1 brick at a time. Choi Eun-hye was practicing by the pole. Her movements were beautiful, fluid, powerful. A new technique she called the flow of warm water. It was unlike any school. Not icy heart, not burning palm, something in between, something of her own. She saw Seode and stopped. She walked over. She said that last night she'd sensed movement near the 5th gate. Not her own 5th gate. She was already at the 5th gate, at the 6th. So Dan looked at her with chi vision. The channels were clear. The flow was powerful. No blockages. Yes, she was on the threshold of the 6th gate. In 3 months, she had traveled a path that others take 3 years to complete. Not because she had become stronger, because she had stopped fighting with herself. Yun Sori was sitting by the well, quiet, at peace. The tick hadn't appeared in a month. Her 1st gate was open, and qi flowed through her gently and evenly. She hadn't become a fighter. She hadn't become a master. She had become something else. She could hear. Not the way Sohmeyer hears a heartbeat. It was different. Yun Sori could hear lies. When a person lies, their breathing changes slightly. A micro-pause before a word. A slightly shorter inhalation. Yun Sori picked up on it without fail. She had become the courtyard's ears. Quiet, attentive ears. Sodan sat down next to her. She slid a bowl of porridge toward him. Half a boiled egg lay on top. Just like on the first day. Sodan looked at the egg and smirked. She looked at him and did the same. She didn't smile. She smirked, with the corner of her lips, quietly. They sat by the well and ate. In the evening, Sodan called everyone together. The courtyard. Sunset.
26 people sat in a semicircle. Sodan stood in the center. He held a scroll in his hands, a copy of the 10th Way tablet. He said he wanted to read something to them. And he read it. Not the entire text, just the first 3 lines. Qi belongs to the world, not to a person. A person does not possess qi. He channels it. The cleaner the channel, the more qi flows through it. The purity of the channel depends on constancy. 26 people listened. Then Sodan said that starting tomorrow, these words would be open to everyone. Not a mystery, not a secret, not a teaching for the chosen few. Anyone who comes to the courtyard and wants to learn how to breathe will receive this knowledge for free. No rank, no stigma, no exam. Because breathing belongs to no one. Like air.
Han Minju said that the great clans won't be happy. Sodan said he knew. Eunhae said that the He clan would return. Sodung said he knew. Bae Hanil said that meant war. Sodung said maybe. Then he looked at them, at each one. The cook, the stable hand, the children, the herbalist, the swordswoman, the mentor, the girl who couldn't breathe 2 months ago, the boy with a squint, the girl who thought she'd end up hunchbacked. His people. He said he couldn't promise safety. He couldn't promise victory. He promised one thing, that every morning he would stand in this courtyard and speak. Breathe in for 4, breathe out for 6. Longer, even longer. And as long as even one person stands nearby and breathes, the courtyard lives on. Night. Sodan lay on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. A voice in his head rang out quietly, softly. Not female, not male, just warm. An achievement. The first disciple of the 10th path. No, not quite. An achievement. The first 26 disciples of the 10th path. Sodan closed his eyes. The plus sign had no number, just warmth. Then the voice said one more thing, the last, in the same soft tone. Welcome home. Sodan lay in the darkness.
Behind the wall, his people were sleeping. 26 people who would get up tomorrow morning and go out into the courtyard. And they would breathe. Breathe in for a count of 4. Breathe out for a count of 6. +1. +1. +1. 100 is just 100 times 1. And 1,000 is 10 times 100. And 10,000 is 100 times 100. And if 26 people do 1 each day, then in a year, that's almost 10,000. So Dan smiled into the darkness. He didn't become immortal. He didn't ascend to heaven. He didn't defeat all the clans. He did something else. He taught the cook to sleep without pain. He taught the girl not to be afraid to breathe in. He taught the swordswoman not to be ashamed of her body heat. He taught the boy with a squint to trust his body. He taught the herbalist to breathe without wheezing. And tomorrow, 5 more will come, and he'll teach them too, because that's the only thing he knows how to do. Break the impossible down into 1,000 achievable repetitions, and not let a person give up. A warm wind blew from behind the mountains. It carried qi, lots of qi. So Dan inhaled, a full, deep, mindful breath. All the way to the bottom. And he exhaled, long and slow,
counting to 8. Above the courtyard of small steps, something clicked softly, like a door opening. A distant one. A large one. One that had long been locked. The 10th way had returned to the world. Not with thunder, not with lightning, with an exhalation.